Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D and WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the second part of What If Deku Became a Monster. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Detective Naomasa almost trips when he first steps foot on what may as well be ground zero. Barriers that rival a prison's walls hid the devastation site well from the road. But beyond those gates, it's complete fallout. What must have once been business buildings are now leveled. Rubble and wooden heaps are piles that would be enough to turn the zone into a junkyard. A huge gaping hole in the ground grants access to a network of metallic hallways that run beneath it. No doubt, a team has already been dispatched to explore where those tunnels lead. However, what Naomasa has to worry about is cleaning up what's on the surface. Waiting for the detective amidst the crime scene is the underground hero that called him here. The pro hero Sir Night-Eye, who had been investigating the Yakuza as well, and surprisingly Toshinori with an even more surprising fourth person. The latter is much younger than the others, but a blonde like Toshinori and certainly in the profession of hero work judging by the red cape billowing behind him. Unsure of how long the group has been waiting for him, Naomasa removes his hat to place over his chest in an apologetic gesture. I take it you've all already become acquainted with one another. The detective shoots a glance in Toshinori's direction that meets the blonde's eye. Once the two are locked onto each other, he briefly shifts his gaze to Aizawa, silently asking if he knows that he's All Might. Toshinori subtly shakes his head. I don't think you and I have had the pleasure yet. The younger of the bunch steps forward with his hand outstretched. Naomasa returns the gesture and the two shake in greeting. I'm Mirio Tagata. He then strikes a pose that practically screams power from the way his muscles flex. Lemillion. I believe you two will be working closely together in the future. Toshinori politely interjects by placing a hand on each of their shoulders. When Naomasa looks into the blue of the number one hero's eyes, he can see the sincerity in that statement. Toshinori's smile is so soft and tender that it looks sheepish. Being a detective, Naomasa reads between the lines. He realizes just who Tagata is, that he truly does represent the younger generation of heroes. Seeing Sir Night-Eye present all but confirms it. Naomasa smiles, his a sweet sorrowful softness, equally as tender like a fresh cut. I'm sure we will. He acknowledges Lemillion as All Might's successor in that moment with a bittersweet acceptance. We're working together right now. Aizawa deadpans with a sense of dry humor. He sizes Toshinori up and down with his eyes, skeptical of the blonde's presence. Remembering him from Night-Eye's office, he holds his tongue for the time being. The underground hero is too tired to solve another mystery, so he sighs in surrender before relenting. I'm still not sure how you factor into all of this, but if Night-Eye and Detective Tsukachi vouch for you, then feel free to listen in. Naomasa can't decide between wanting to roll his eyes at Aizawa's antics or laughing. The detective can only imagine what the tired underground hero would come up with if he only knew about All Might and One for All. With how far-fetched Aizawa's theories usually are, it'd be amusing and entertaining for once. Aizawa glances around the circle of people that's gathered before beginning. This was the last known stronghold used by the Yakuza. They were a dying population, an endangered species if you will, and now they've been wiped out in the blink of an eye. Cross-referencing my reports, the number of stakeouts, sting operations, and all else my agency has done to catch the Yakuza with their hand in the cookie jar, Aizawa is 100% correct. Sir Night-Eye continues for the underground hero. He smooths out his combed green hair before elaborating. All bodies, despite their disfigurement, have been identified. The entire Yakuza is present and accounted for. Toshinori grits his teeth in frustration, his usual smile vanishing. When the hero gets passionate about something, he has a hard time keeping that righteous rage in check. The blonde's fists tremble at his sides as he applies pressure to clench them tight. It shouldn't have gone like this. So gruesome. Tagata surveys the crime scene with an equally troubled expression. He seems as though he's only now noticed the corpses. It's not heroic at all, as all he has to say about the way the Yakuza was mangled. Naomasa sees why Toshinori chose the boy now. There's a bit of himself in his successor. They both agree that the Yakuza should have been brought down by heroes and the police, that villains and criminals alike should be defeated by the law. Their view of justice is the same. Naomasa is sure Toshinori chose correctly. He nods his head in humble agreement with their sentiments and his friend's decision for a successor. Night-Eye hums in mutual consensus before continuing. While this ends the chapter on the Yakuza, it doesn't quite close the book. His calculating gaze shifts to Naomasa, as feared. This ties directly into your investigation on the Tokyo ghoul. The detective is startled by suddenly being made the center of attention. Under the gaze of Night-Eye no less. Whether that stare is with his foresight quirk activated or not, it's unsettling. Naomasa does his own surveillance of the crime scene before responding. Though he'd already seen it all on the way in, he really takes in the amount of destruction. This time, he thinks about it rather than just looking. How do we know this was the ghoul? While the bodies are his this wreckage isn't. He inquires the group to see if they managed to gather any concrete evidence yet. Of course, Aizawa is the one to speak on behalf of them when it comes to this part. This wreckage is from a rampage. Based on my theory that the ghoul is a preteen or a teenager, a temper tantrum isn't far-fetched. And it's of course all based merely on speculation. That's an assumption, Aizawa. We've been over this. Naomasa refrains from slapping his palm too hard into his face. He swears he feels wrinkles starting to come in at this point. However, Night Eye is quick to defend Eraserhead. What's not an assumption is that the Yakuza was holding a child here. Once that child went missing, this happened. He prevents his glasses from sliding any further down his nose by pushing them up. That can't be a coincidence. Not you too. Naomasa winces in sympathy for Toshinori's former sidekick. He knows what it's like to be roped into Aizawa's crazy conspiracies and to actually start believing them. Trying to remain the voice of reason, he persists. That still doesn't mean it was all the ghoul. Aizawa crosses his arms over his chest before asking with a raised brow, "Weren't you the one who originally suspected the ghoul was involved with the Yakuza?" Naomasa opens his mouth to deny the claim, but remembers asking that question when Aizawa first contacted him about the Yakuza resurfacing. "That's only because I didn't expect you to call me for any other reason," he says as an excuse more for himself than the team that's assembled. When he sees none of them are convinced, he goes for a different approach. "Look, I'm trying to be optimistic here. We don't want this to be ghoul-related. It's almost like you're hoping this is the ghoul's work." "I am hopeful," Aizawa admits. All heads turn towards the underground hero, surprised by his statement. Naomasa wonders if all that sleep deprivation and caffeine finally destroyed his mind. That's until he explains himself. If it is, then we have another lead towards catching them. The ghoul has never acted on impulse this emotionally before. I told you, there's people influencing their actions now. As much sense as that reasoning makes, Toshinori shakes his head. I'm with Naomasa. We don't want this to be the ghoul. That remark doesn't help better Aizawa's opinion of the blonde judging by the frown he wears. Toshinori sees the expression and returns it with his own. Not backing down. He explains himself like Aizawa had to for everyone to understand. If they are just a child, then we want them to be rehabilitated. Going from robbing blood banks to this is a big leap in the wrong direction. Night Eye massages his chin as he mulls over both sides of the argument, stroking a non-existent beard of wisdom. When he can't decide which one he agrees with, he shifts his focus back to Toshinori. After all that the ghoul has done, you think they can still be rehabilitated? It's a valid question that he directs at the symbol of peace. Except, it's that symbol's successor that answers. Anyone can be saved. His smile is a radiant ray of hope brighter than the sun. Toshinori's smile is much more reserved, but noticeable when Tagata adds, "That's the job of a hero." Aizawa takes interest in the younger hero and directs his own questions towards him. What if they can't help themselves? What if it's more than blood? What if they can only eat flesh? But his tone sounds like genuine concern and not some sort of counter-argument, taking pity on the poor boy so that he doesn't fall under Aizawa's wrath. And having had enough of the group's bickering, Naomasa decides to intervene. "We'll cross those bridges when we get there. Right now, we need to focus on actually finding the ghoul." He glances from member to member of the ragtag team. "That's why we're all meeting, right?" "Yes," Night Eye nods. "This has become a group effort. We all need to report to one another if this is to work." Aizawa faces Night Eye to tack on. "We should break into teams. We'll accomplish more that way. Since the Yakuza was yours to begin with, you can follow this rabbit hole to see if it goes anywhere." But Naomasa doesn't want to let the underground hero become team captain if he can help it. The detective pulls way too many all-nighters as it is. "And what about you?" He asks Aizawa to see if he can trip him up. Considering Eraserhead doesn't smile often, and his grin is nowhere near as bright or assuring as Tagata's or Toshinori's, the shivers that run down the detective's spine are to be expected. "Don't worry, Tsukachi, I'm not off the hook either. As a matter of fact, you're with me," Aizawa says with a toothy smirk. "What? Why?" Naomasa grabs his head in bewilderment. He has no hat to scrunch, only hair to pull. He just might yank it all out. "We've still got the mask shop to investigate. It's been long enough that you got that search warrant we talked about, right?" Aizawa reverts to his usual all-business and no-pleasure demeanor to remind the detective of their previous arrangement. Remembering that tied to the Yakuza and potential lead on the ghoul, Naomasa nods. "Yeah, then it's settled." Aizawa concludes the meeting by starting to break away from the small huddle. Before he can walk too far away though, Toshinori catches him by the shoulder. When Aizawa looks back, "What about us?" The deflated hero gestures between himself and Tagata. Aizawa's shrug knocks the blonde's hand off his shoulder. "You tell me." He dismisses the two before resuming his walk towards the exit. When the blonde turns around to ask the others for their input, Naomasa shrugs too. "Sorry, Toshinori. I always hate to admit it, but when Aizawa is right, he's right." The detective deflates just as much as the frail form of the hero once he makes that confession. seeing nobody else has a task for them. Night Eye offers a solution to the pair of blondes. The best you two can do is patrol this general vicinity and hope the ghoul keeps a small hunting ground before waving for them to leave too. Yeah, Toshinori sighs as he follows behind the retreating form of Aizawa. We can only hope. Little does the hero know, the Tokyo ghoul actually is nearby, working his regular shift at Anteku. Akatani Makumo serves coffee to customers while occasionally taking a sip from his own cup. Meanwhile, Eri sits at her usual table waiting for him to finish working. The little girl looks up from her coloring book to see a boy sitting at the table across from her. He has evenly split peppermint hair and a burn scar that reaches from his hairline to the bottom half of his cheek. What interests her the most about the customer, however, is what he's holding in his hands. Eri is startled by surprise when the boy looks up from the novel that he's reading. Heterochromic eyes squint when they meet the horned girls. Yes, the boy tilts his head as he tries to gauge the child that's been staring at him. Sorry, Eri squeaks out as she shrinks in on herself to the size of a mouse. Past traumatic experience has her recalling the punishments she would get from the Yakuza. She glances in the direction of Akatani, knowing that he'd protect her. Yet, she can't help but be afraid of what the scarred boy might do to her. Recognizing the small girl's body language all too well, the boy softens his glare. There's no reason to apologize, he says as an attempt to put her at ease. When Eri looks back up, having not expected that from him, he tries to follow her eyeline. He's not usually self-conscious about it, but he has a feeling he knows just why a child would take interest in his appearance as well as be afraid of him. Were you staring at my scar? He asks. Eri's eyes widen with her mouth, a panicked realization dawning on her. And no, she exclaims to clear up the misunderstanding. Her eyes fall on the book in the boy's hands. My brother is reading me that book. Her voice wobbles a bit, but she works up enough courage to give an explanation. Realizing he jumped to conclusions, the boy's own eyes widen a bit. He too looks down at the novel he's holding. He doesn't think the little girl in front of him is the right reading age for it, but he isn't the best at estimating how old somebody is either. He's fairly certain the girl is no older than 10 though. Unfamiliar with how to interact with kids, he's a little more awkward than usual when he says, "Oh, yes, it's very good." Relief relaxing her expression, Eri perks up a little. She nods in agreement. I don't understand some of the words sometimes, but Big Bro teaches me what they mean. The boy nods too, pleased that he was right in the assumption that she wouldn't be able to read a book of that level. That's nice. He's uncertain of how to reply though. He's not used to being social, let alone with a kid, scrambling for a way to break the awkward silence. He finds another common ground. I have older siblings too. That must have been the right thing to say, since Eri's mouth hangs open in awe. Her eyes shimmer under the sunbeams that shoot through the window. Are they as nice as a kata ni? The interest she has to hear his answer has her leaning forward in her chair. A faint trace of a smile crosses the boy's lips. He wants to laugh at the nickname the little girl gave her brother, but refrains from it as to not upset her. Yes, they are. His smile softens as he speaks with fondness, especially my sister. I have a big sis too. Eri bounces with joy in her seat. She radiates with happiness over being able to relate with the boy in so many ways. The coloring book she has just so happened to be one that Himeko herself doodled in. The blood-red crayon-colored heart that the blonde drew makes Eri say, she's nice like a kata ni, but silly. Familiar with the concept of siblings, the boy can't withhold a small chuckle this time. My sister is silly too, he says while recalling the occasions that his sister would try to cheer him up. Taking a moment to pause his work of taking orders, Akatani checks on Eri with a glance. When he sees his younger sister talking to some random guy, his instinct to protect her kicks in. Eri, are you all right? The brotherly barista is at her table in a flash. He looks her over for injuries, not finding anything, but only lessens his concern when she nods in confirmation that she isn't harmed. Akatani then remembers where he's at and feigns being apologetic to the customer. I'm so sorry, sir. She's usually too shy to do this sort of thing. She was no trouble. The boy waves dismissively before extending that same hand. You must be a kata ni. Taken aback by the customer's usage of Eri's nickname, he stumbles over himself a bit before being able to shake hands. It's actually a Akatani. He stammers with a small blush of embarrassment. The boy's small smile returns when he sees the red dusting the barista's cheeks. I like a kata ni better. He shrugs his shoulders as he teases Akatani. Seeing Akatani's blush turn even brighter, Eri tilts her head in curiosity. Glancing between the two boys, she innocently asks a not-so-innocent question. Is this like when you and Big Sis flirt? The boy with peppermint hair raises a brow, sending Akatani into a full spiral. It's not like that, he blurts out in an attempt to avoid a miscommunication. Her big sis isn't actually blood-related. After trying to salvage the situation, Akatani mumbles under his breath, I shouldn't have told her what flirting. The customer's smile stretches as he watches Akatani murmur. He finds it amusing how easily flustered the waiter gets. I'm Shoto, He interrupts the panicked jumble of words. Akatani pauses, not quite catching what was said during his mutter frenzy. He blinks. My name, Shoto explains before reintroducing himself properly. I'm Shoto Todoroki. Being a former hero fanatic and closet otaku, Akatani jumps at the recognition of the boy's family name, Todoroki, like the number 2 hero Endeavor Todoroki. He shouts in a moment of euphoria over meeting the number 2 hero's son. Shoto's smile drops at the mention of Endeavor. Yes, Akatani flinches at the cold bite of the boy's tone. Can we not talk about my father though? Just now noticing the burn mark on Shoto's face, Akatani comes to his own assumed conclusions. Oh, he bows apologetically for having been insensitive. I'm sorry. Shoto feels the other boy's eyes on his scar. Placing a hand over the permanent burn, he sighs and clears up any misplaced thoughts. He wasn't the one that did this if that's what you're thinking. Shoto can see surprise mixed with confusion cross Akatani's face before his expression becomes something more relieved. What Shoto says next wipes that relieved expression away. It was my mother's doing. She hated my quirk. Shoto turns his head, no longer looking at Akatani directly. Akatani swallows whatever condolences he could have given. He's sure Todoroki has heard all of it before and that those words are just empty without meaning by now. Looking at Eri, Akatani instead comes up with a potential solution to the burn victim's shame. I know we just met and this might be presumptuous of me, but Eri and I get ridiculed for our quirks too. Shoto's head shoots up in surprise and he finds himself staring at the pair of illegitimate adoptive siblings again. So we actually attend this quirk support group. Maybe you would like to come with us. Staring at the two who claim to be brother and sister, Shoto can't find any physical similarities between the two. One's hair is a pure silky white while the other's is a charcoal black. Yet, he can still see the bond that they share. For two people who get ridiculed for their quirks, they exude an attitude that Shoto can't say he's familiar with. In the short span of time that he's met them, they made him smile more than he has during the past year. Unable to turn down the offer of such good people, Shoto says, I would like that. The unlikely trio of Todoroki, Mikumo, and Eri stride in a synchronous step. Their line creates an unintentional wall of tallest to shortest. Yet, none of them notice. Eri at the tail end clings to Akatani's hand like a lifeline, her tiny palm only managing to grab a few fingers in its small size. Todoroki keeps his heterochromic gaze forward while the other boy looks at him from the side. Despite Todoroki's lack of making eye contact or at least glancing in Akatani's direction, the two carry a conversation seemingly well. Both boys overcome their shy-by-nature attitude for the most part. It's not like they've ascended from introvert to extrovert though. There's still plenty of awkward or curt responses from Todoroki in particular, for example, a few of which gain giggles from Eri. The three youths journey down a corridor, heading for the quirk support group meeting at the end of the hall. Wow, I always dreamed of going to UA. What's it like? Akatani is only now getting over the initial stupor of learning Todoroki is attending Japan's top hero school. Todoroki shrugs as though it's no big deal, treating it just like any other school. Akatani would be inclined to disagree. And he's not the only one. Not if you're in the hero course. Shinso overhears them as they draw near the building's vending machines. The snack station has become their usual meeting place due to their mutual love for coffee. Akatani waves with his free hand, smiling despite the lazy look Shinso gives the group of three. Shinso, I was wondering if you were gonna be here today. Though Akatani was admittedly hoping that the other boy would be so that he could introduce him to Todoroki. I know who he is. Shinso's eyes stop drooping so that they can squint at the hero in training who had tagged along. Todoroki returns the glare with one of his own, also noting the bitterness of Shinso's tone. The effort it takes to scowl with how heavy his eye bags are must be too much, because Shinso lets it drop first. However, not without asking first, what's somebody with a privileged quirk like his doing here? Akatani's own eyes widen in shock at how harsh Shinso is being. Come on, that's not fair. He tries to step in between the two but Todoroki moves forward first. That's okay, Mikumo. I know when I'm not welcomed. He continues to direct his glare at Shinso despite addressing Akatani. Akatani makes sure that he gets in between them this time, letting go of Eri so that he can wave both hands in a placating manner. I'm sure that's not what Shinso meant. He forces a fake chuckle in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. Don't speak for me. I meant what I said. Shinso snaps at Akatani next before returning his anger back to Todoroki. He was blessed with a quirk meant for heroics, and yet he wants to come here to complain. Todoroki smirks mirthlessly, a scoff making him sound arrogant to the insomniac. When he raises his left hand to waist level, a few sparks of flame flicker from it. The power display reminds Akatani of someone he knew in his former life. Todoroki incredulously repeats, a blessing? Don't act like the son of Endeavor would be born with a curse. Shinso sneers as he too looks at the side of Todoroki that's able to produce fire. Todoroki's glare flicks forward from his hand, staring at the other boy with animosity. Some of us aren't the children of pro-heroes. The outstretched hand folds into a fist when Shinso voices his mutual disdain. Before Akatani can try intervening again, he feels something small grab onto the leg of his pants. Akata Niai. He sees Eri looking up at him with a worrisome expression. Why are they yelling? Taking one of her hands in one of his again to comfort her, he says, "It's okay, Eri. There's nothing to be worried about." Her gaze moves from him back to the other teenagers, unconvinced. Akatani sighs before raising his voice towards them. "Come on, guys. You're scaring Eri." The two stop their bickering to glance over at him and the horned little girl, surprised by the aggressiveness in his tone. Realizing he was perhaps too hostile with how he sounded, he dials it back down with a small plea of, "Can't we just get along?" Shinso opens his mouth as though he's about to retort, pauses, and then frowns. Shaking his head in surrender, he turns his back to the group. "I'm going to grab a seat before they're all taken." He doesn't bother glancing back as he uses his excuse to walk away from them. Todoroki watches with Akatani, both boys wondering whether or not one of them should try calling out or going after him. Figuring he doesn't know Shinso well enough, Todoroki resigns himself to defeat as well. "I shouldn't have come." He turns to walk in the opposite direction while apologizing to Akatani, sorry for causing a disturbance. "No, stay." But Akatani won't let another one of his friends walk out on him. He grabs Todoroki by the shoulder in order to stop him in his tracks. Todoroki is surprised by the strength in the boy's grip, but doesn't say nor show any signs of it aside from a glance back. "I don't know what got into Shinso, but..." Akatani lets his hand slip from Todoroki's shoulder as he suggests, "This is a place for sharing. If you're comfortable, maybe you can make him understand how you feel." Todoroki refrains from expressing his internal contemplation, only holding his stare with the other boy. It's as though he'd been frozen in place by the very implication of sharing his feelings. It's as though he'd been asked to tread on thin ice. "Have you or Eri ever told anyone how you feel?" He asks to see if they'd taken that confident chance yet. Akatani's mouth forms a thin line, unable to say he has. He places a hand on Eri's head, looking down at the little girl. "I think if others show that it's okay to be open about it, that then she'll open up too." It's a subtle way of saying he's mostly here for her and not himself. Having siblings of his own, Todoroki can empathize to a certain extent. He sighs before giving a single nod of agreement. "Fine, I'll give it a try." More relieved than surprised to hear it, Akatani perks up with a shout of, "Great." He's about to lead the charge straight into the meeting before he realizes the other reason why they stopped by the snack station. "Oh, let me just grab a coffee first." He digs into his pocket for his wallet to buy one from the vending machines while asking, "You want anything, Eri?" When the little girl shakes her head, he turns his towards the other boy, Todoroki. "We just came from a coffee shop." Todoroki deadpans with the monotone demeanor that Akatani had been more used to than the exchange between he and Shinso. "Oh, I guess we did." Akatani remembers that they did indeed come here from Anteku while bashfully running a hand through his hair. He then chuckles nervously while trying to cover for himself with the usual excuse he's become accustomed to giving people. "My quirk actually makes me have to consume a certain amount of coffee though, so..." "Oh," is the only way Todoroki knows how to respond to that, though there's no actual genuine shock in his voice nor face. When a canned coffee rolls out upon purchase, Akatani grabs it with a disappointed downward sag of his shoulders. They've only got heated left." He was hoping to get one of the iced coffees, but they're all sold out. Todoroki holds out his right hand, prompting Akatani to hand him the can. "Let me see." Akatani raises an eyebrow in confusion, but curiously passes it over. Almost instantaneously, frost flakes the metal as Todoroki cools the coffee down using his right side. "Whoa!" Akatani exclaims in awe at the display of power. After seeing Todoroki create fire, he wasn't expecting to see ice as well. "Is that your quirk?" His astonishment becomes mistaken for wonderment when he asks a question that he already knows the answer to by this point. Todoroki nods as he returns the chilled coffee to Akatani. A somber smile so small that it's easily missed forms from his mouth as he explains half-heartedly, "My mother's side." Akatani cocks his head to the side in confusion as he pops open the lid to his coffee. "What do you mean?" he asks before taking a sip. Todoroki's smile turns downwards, much more noticeable, as he says, "The other half is my father's quirk." Akatani picks up on the boy's peculiar wording, swallowing his current gulp of coffee. "Your father's." But before he can try to figure out what Todoroki means, we're beginning. A shout comes from the meeting room of the quirk support group. Todoroki turns in the direction of which the voice came, planning on following it to its source to avoid discussing his quirk any further. "We should go. We wouldn't want to be late," he says as an excuse to drop the topic and walk away. Akatani looks down, planning on being downtrodden. but finds his illegitimate sister staring up at him instead. Not wanting to upset her more than the entire encounter just then may already have, he offers her an assuring smile as best as he can muster before taking her hands in his in order to lead her to the support group's makeshift circle of chairs. Thank you all for coming. An orange-skinned woman the size of the chair she's in welcomes everyone with a toothless smile. She flashes her gums towards Todoroki in what's meant to be a kind gesture. I see we have a new face in the crowd. Before turning her gaze to everyone else, remember, all are welcome. Everyone is free to listen or share. None of us have the right to judge the other. Akatani catches Shinso staring at Todoroki, but the purple-haired boy quickly looks away. So no pressure, newbie. Take it at your own pace. The ringleader then finishes her opening statement. Todoroki glances at Akatani, remembering his agreement to speak. Shinso returns his gaze to the newcomer when he says, I don't mind sharing. Oh ho, brave one. The ringleader praises Todoroki with a tiny applause of encouragement. I sure as hell couldn't share during my first time. An older man with 5 sets of eyes that each wears glasses chimes in as well. The man next to him folds his arms before grumbling, first time. Bakumo and Shinso haven't shared still. Todoroki hums as he looks over at Akatani. Both he and Shinso have their heads down, not wanting the unwarranted attention. Will you if I do? Todoroki asks anyways. The entire room goes silent in anticipation, not wanting to miss hearing the answer. Akatani doesn't have to lift his head to see Todoroki is still staring at him. Even Shinso from across the room has an expectant look. Akatani turns his head to see Eri beaming up at him, clearly agreeing with everyone that she'd like to hear him share. Maybe a little. He mumbles. That must be good enough for Todoroki. He responds, okay, before readdressing the entire room to begin his sharing. Are you all aware of what quirk marriages are? Meanwhile, someone else is going to have answers unwillingly pried out of them in the interrogation room of a police precinct. Yuta, the mask maker, sits in a rickety chair waiting for someone to sit in the replica across the table in front of him. His own reflection in a one-way mirror is all the company he has for now. Eventually, Detective Naomasa enters the room through a steel door. It only opens from the outside, latches locking thanks to a mechanism on the other end when it closes behind him. Sorry to keep you waiting. The detective removes his tan overcoat to hang on the backrest of his chair before sitting down. Yuta narrows his eyes at the detective's rectangular ones. I thought you didn't suspect me for anything. He recalls their first meeting and compares it with where he is now. Is there a reason for us to suspect you? Naomasa sounds nonchalant, but the question is anything but casual. He's hoping his lie-detecting quirk will be able to catch Yuta right away. Hook, line, and sinker. Yuta tugs on the handcuffs attached to his wrist. The other end is attached to a table leg. No second arm to connect to instead. There's a reason why you arrested me. He tries to hide his annoyance, but it's evident in his tone. We took you into police custody. This isn't exactly a formal arrest. Naomasa notes the difference for the record. He knows it's safe to add, although it can be, to apply an intimidating pressure for the interrogation though. Like there's a difference. Yuta mutters under his breath before asking louder for Naomasa to hear. Why am I here? Rather than beat around the bush any longer, Naomasa places a burlap sack on the table. It's not just any old potato sack though. It has eye holes and a mouth stitching. That search warrant I came back to your store with helped us find this. Naomasa gestures to the mask before prompting Yuta to elaborate. Care to explain? Yuta swallows the lump forming in his throat. He recognizes what he made for Sorimitsu tape right away. Except, he also believes there's no evidence that would determine that's who it belongs to. It's a mask. I run a mask shop. Hardly anything incriminating. He tries to act unfazed by it. While Yuta's poker face is good, Naomasa isn't willing to give up so easily. He leans back in his chair with a sigh, prepared for the long haul if that's what it takes to get answers. I'm only about to tell you this because it's a legal requirement per interrogation. He hopes that the revelation of his quirk will work in his favor and not against him as he says, my quirk allows me to detect whether or not you are lying. A lie is considered an admission of guilt, so I suggest cooperating. When Yuta's eyes broaden, Naomasa takes that as a sign to begin, since that can only mean he understands. Did you sell to the Yakuza? The detective starts with a simple question first. Yuta hesitates, not wanting to answer but knowing there's no use in being uncooperative or lying. So he relents and answers truthfully, yes. Naomasa nods when his quirk lets him know that Yuta wasn't lying. That was a test, he says, since he already knew about the mask maker supplying the Yakuza. He returns to the particular mask sold and in his current possession, jamming it with a finger. This next question is important. Why were you in possession of the mask here? Yuta grits his teeth, not quite baring them like fangs, but definitely being backed into a corner. He knows exactly who returned the mask to him. He won't so easily give a name though, as someone brought it back to the shop, is what he says instead as an attempt to mislead the detective. Naomasa refrains from grinding his own teeth together in mutual frustration. Instead, he continues to pry Yuta's mouth open for answers by asking for more specific details for repairs. No, Yuta shoots the question down easily since his answer is true. But that just provides Naomasa with a window of opportunity to dig a little deeper. He knows Yuta has something to hide if he's trying to prolong the process this much. Who brought it to you? Was it the Yakuza? He feels like he already knows the answer but asks regardless. Yuta avoids the first question entirely, opting for the second. No, it wasn't the Yakuza. And the answer he gives is exactly what Naomasa was expecting. Considering they both already knew the Yakuza were buying from him, it wouldn't have been an admission of any kind of guilt to say they just brought one of the masks back, which means whoever had the mask wasn't a member of the Yakuza. Considering the Shy Hasekai was massacred, Naomasa suspects that the person in question must be the one responsible for it, regardless of whether that's the ghoul like Aizawa suspects or not. It'll be a huge break in the investigation to discover their identity. I see. Naomasa nods as he comes to terms with his own deductive reasoning, wanting to broach that possibility. He tries asking, "Are you aware that the Yakuza has been completely wiped out?" An unreadable reaction comes from Yuta. He's unable to remain stoic anymore, mouth as wide as his eyes. Naomasa almost mistakes it for complete and total surprise, prepared to dismiss his prior theory, but then notices the shakiness of Yuta's single hand. The chain of the handcuffs rattles. I don't know what to say. Yuta truly is shaken to the core. Not because he cares about the Yakuza though, and not quite because he wasn't expecting their demise either. To Naomasa, it looks more like an expression of awe over something finally happening. Perhaps there were no expectations, but something else. A possibility. A chance. He knew that it could maybe happen. I'll take that as a yes. Naomasa keeps his eyes on Yuta as he searches for any other nonverbal responses. When he finds none, he tries to be more direct. Answer me this. Do you know who did it? Yuta's eyes begin to water. He's holding back tears, trying to shake them away with his head. I do. He hates himself for admitting that to the detective. Naomasa leans forward in his seat. He's sure that the underground hero watching the interrogation from the other side of the one-way mirror is leaning forward in anticipation too. Was it the Tokyo ghoul? The detective's voice trembles as much as Yuta himself. Yuta's body is racked with sobs as he gives in to the tears. Please, he cries out to anyone that'll hear his begging. The detective, God, even though he's looking down at the floor from which the devil dwells, Yuta knows he'll be going there. For how can God forgive him when he can't forgive himself? Akutami on the other hand, Yuta wipes the tears from his eyes so that he can look Naomasa in his. He's just a kid. He doesn't know any better. Shinso's shoulders sag similarly to the skin under his eyes as he listens to Todoroki's tale of woe. A few winces and grimaces wash over the group in waves when they hear about the abuse. Some relate, rubbing bruises of their own. It's something none of them expected to hear. Akutami sneaks a glance at Eri, reminded of the girl's time spent with the Yakuza. The bandages she used to wear and what was underneath haunts him just as much as it must her. My father used my mother to get his masterpiece of a quirk. Todoroki summarizes the story as he creates a flame in the palm of one hand while emitting frost from the other to demonstrate. The scarred boy no longer sounds resentful, just sad. Even when he says, "That's why I despise his side." Shinso continues staring at Todoroki, as though he's studying him. The son of Endeavor stares at his open palms with such dismay that he'd have you believe they're covered in blood. Akutami knows what that's like. To look at your hands, yourself, and see something horrendous. Todoroki's hands don't appear dirty to the group, but he clearly sees something on them that they don't. Todoroki only breaks from the inner turmoil when Shinso causes a disruption. The chair legs scraping against the floor when Shinso stands up draws everyone's attention. Just as abruptly as he stood, Shinso turns and leaves. After a moment of awkward silence, nobody knowing whether they should go to or what to say if they choose to stay, the group leader clears her throat, redrawing everyone's attention. The orange-skinned woman offers a sympathetic smile. Thank you for sharing. That was very brave of you. The group collectively nods in agreement with her sentiment. Akutami turns to the other boy, carefully placing a hand on his shoulder to apply a tender touch. The scarred boy isn't being responsive to any of it. He's looking past them all. Beyond Akutami, he's staring in the direction that Shinso went. Todoroki. Akutami gently prods. How do you feel? Hearing the other boy, Todoroki seems to slightly pull out of it. Better. He's lacking the confidence behind that answer though. His uncertainty comes through even more when he adds, I think. Seeing Akutami and the others concerned for his well-being, he offers them a tiny smile of assurance. It was nice to say it all out loud. However, his heterochromic eyes keep glancing in the direction that Shinso left from, having Akutami believe that's who Todoroki wanted to hear it most. Looking in that same direction, Akutami asks, do you want to step out of the room for a bit? Todoroki finally breaks his gaze from the exit to look at Akutami. He sees the other boy, following the outstretched arm to his shoulder. Sure. Todoroki nods to show his appreciation before standing up. I think I would. Akatani takes Iri's hand in his while waving goodbye to the support group with the other. Thanks everyone. The small crowd reciprocates the gesture before he follows Todoroki's tracks. You ready to go, or do you want to go back later? Akatani asks Iri as they leave so that she doesn't feel left out. The little girl shrugs, indifferent to the decision. When the trio go through the exit and enter the hall, all three are surprised to a sudden stop. None of them expected to find none other than Shinso waiting for them there. The purple-headed boy has his hands in his pockets before taking them out to place at his sides in order to bow. I'm sorry. He apologizes while facing Todoroki in particular. I was narrow-minded. I thought being born with a quirk not useful for heroics was the only reason someone could be burdened. Raising his back, but not his head, he continues, I didn't realize that there was more to it than that. The glazed look Todoroki had moistens. For a fleeting moment, he just might have cried. It's okay. He gestures for Shinso to raise his head. I forgive you. Akatani refrains from breathing a sigh of relief beside him. Shinso doesn't lift his head just yet though. He's not done apologizing. I know it's no excuse, but it's just that. His dampened eyes tightly clamp shut in frustration. I applied for UA too. That shocks both Todoroki and Akatani. Neither of them expected to hear any of this. Finally lifting his head, Shinso opens his eyes again. I took the entrance exam and failed because my quirk wasn't suited for the test. His voice is distantly reflective as he explains, I'm in Gen Ed now, but I so badly wanted to be a hero. Shinso, Akatani can't help but empathize despite not having taken a hero school's entrance exam himself. He at least knows what it's like to have the dream of becoming a hero ripped away due to the quirk you're born with. It's a sensitive subject, so he tries to be as gentle as he can when prompting Shinso to share some more. What is your quirk, if you don't mind me asking? The insomniac averts his gaze, fixing it to the floor. The silent response from Shinso almost makes Akatani backpedal. However, the quiet pause doesn't go on for long enough to reach that point. Rather, Shinso pushes past his hesitance enough to ask in a tired tone, Are you sure you want to know? Akatani is a tad reluctant himself, not wanting to pressure Shinso into feeling like he has to answer. Taking a glance towards Todoroki and Iri to see what they think. They're each as equally ambivalent. Shinso waits patiently, expecting a response. Akatani opens his mouth to answer, but finds himself stopping short. Not of his own accord though. It's more like someone else seized control of his voice, silencing him. Akatani finds it hard to speak. He finds it difficult to convey his thoughts. It's like he no longer has any say over himself. Shinso then shows him who does have a say. Nod your head if you're under my control. Akatani feels his head bobbing up and down despite the order not coming from his own mind. Then, after doing as he was commanded, he's freed. Akatani feels in control of his own motor functions again, testing them by opening and closing his mouth or flexing his fingers. My quirk is called brainwashing. Shinso explains what exactly just happened to him. Iri and Todoroki stare at Akatani in wonderment as he comprehends the ability that just allowed Shinso to possess him. Whoa, Akatani feels like a puppet that's just had its string cut as he rolls his shoulders. Your quirk is villainous. Shinso cuts him off. I know. Akatani fervently shakes his head in denial. Not at all. Catching Shinso by surprise. It's amazing. But that makes the boy with bedhead do a double take. It's super suited for hero work, especially if you were to go underground so nobody could see it coming. Todoroki is a stark contrast of passive standing next to Akatani's exuberance. Yet, he agrees with the other boy's sentiment nonetheless. It's plenty powerful enough. If you were to brainwash me before I could encase you in ice, then my quirk would be rendered useless by comparison, he says while Akatani nods along. It's super cool, Shinso. Akatani reassures the brainwasher before turning to the girl holding his hand. Right, Iri? Iri shyly mimics Akatani's earlier nod before joining in with her own praise. Why, you could have told the bad men to stop hurting me. However, she unknowingly alters the mood with her input. Both Todoroki and Shinso shift their posture while looking at Akatani for answers. Bad men. Shinso hardens his gaze. Todoroki does the same, stepping closer to Iri. That's... Akatani stammers as he scrambles for an explanation. He wasn't expecting to be put on the spot, and it's not like he can exactly tell the truth that he massacred the Yakuza to free her. It's a long story. He forces himself to laugh in a poor attempt to lighten the mood. When there's no change in the other boy's aura, he scratches the back of his head to try and jumpstart his brain for an excuse. Fortunately for him, Iri comes to his rescue. Akata Nyai saved me though, so it's okay now, she says while gazing up at the boy who's serving as her older brother. It's evident in her expression that she's shifted her admiration from Shinso back to him. Shinso and Todoroki visibly relax, knowing he had nothing to do with the so-called bad men. Akatani does as well, relieved that they're relieved. He gives Iri's hand a soft squeeze and a small smile. Shinso runs a hand through his unruly head of purple hair. If you two weren't already mysterious enough. Exasperated by the entire exchange, while Shinso finds them to be exhausting. Todoroki finds himself being further intrigued by the sibling-like duo. That reminds me. He shifts his gaze to Akatani in hopes of seeing something more. Makumo, you promised to share if I did. Having completely forgotten his promise, all Akatani can manage at first is a fragile "oh." Feeling his grip slacken, Eri's gaze up at him becomes one laced with concern. Shinso also notes the way his demeanor shifted. I guess you're right. I did say that, didn't I? His voice being so timidly quiet makes Todoroki tilt his head in confusion. Shinso steps forward. You don't have to if you aren't comfortable, hoping to help. But Akatani shakes his head to let him know that he's okay. No, you two confided in me. It's only fair that I tell you my quirk too. His confidence is low as he avoids making eye contact. But, Shinso, when he turns his gaze back up, his eyes look more fatigued than the insomniac's. If anyone's quirk here is villainous, the hand that's not holding Eri's grabs the fabric of the shirt that's covering his heart. It's mine. Eri isn't the type to make an outburst, so nobody expects her to interject with an emotional shout. That's not true. She tugs on Akatani's arm as if that'll shake some sense into him. You saved me and you said heroes save people, so you can't be a villain. Akatani manages a fond but sad smile as he picks up Eri. She clings to him even tighter now that she can hug his body. There's a reason that I didn't try for Yue though, he says to the floor now that he's staring down at the empty space where Eri once was. When he says the rest, it's said facing towards Todoroki, my quirk is powerful too. Except, it's too powerful. He holds Eri a little closer as he recalls what it can do. I can hurt people with it. He rephrases that when he remembers how he managed to keep her. I have hurt people with it. Shinso shifts uncomfortably as he says, why you still haven't told us what it is yet. Akatani sighs when he finds no words to explain it any more than he already has. He figures it'll be easier if he just shows them. So he closes his eyes, covers them with the hand that's not carrying Eri, and lets the ghoul peer through the cage of his mind's eye. When he slides his hand back, it pulls the hair hanging over his one eye to expose both. Each eye now affected by his quirk. He opens them. The red dot at the center of the cracked web is not to be mistaken for something stuck. It's what weaves. It's the arachnid's bite. Look into my eyes and tell me they look like a hero's. The unblinking void stares into the souls of Shinso and Todoroki. Blood-red tendrils sprout from the small of the ghoul's back, its predatory organ dancing in a hypnotizing display. Suddenly, Akatani appears much bigger than his actual size. My quirk makes me a killing machine. His growl is as intimidating as his presence at that moment. For a second, a murderous bloodlust oozes through. Feeling Eri tremble in his arms, Akatani comes to his senses rather than the ghouls. He snaps out of his self-imposed trance, seeing the petrified one he's put his friends and the little girl in. Immediately, the tentacles retract. He closes his eyes, shutting them as tight as he can, making them go back to normal. And he whimpers a lie to make them feel better that he wishes he could believe as well. I could be one. When Akatani reopens his eyes, he sees how pale Shinso looks. Shit, Makumo, I didn't think you could be so scary. Whatever breath he'd been holding also releases a slur of uttered words that he only realizes can be taken as offensive after they've already been said. No offense. Eri puffs up her cheeks in more than a pout as she tries to defend her brother. It's meant to scare the bad guys. Akatani rubs soothing circles into her back as he tries to calm her down. It's okay. I know it's unsightly. He then returns his attention towards Shinso. The other boy is about to say something, but Akatani cuts him off with an attempt to change the subject. Please don't curse in front of Eri though. Shinso shuts his mouth and nods instead. However, Todoroki isn't ready to drop the subject matter of Akatani's quirk just yet. I thought you said your quirk forces you to drink coffee. He doesn't have an accusatory tone, but he does have a skeptical stare. Shinso's face scrunches up in a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Coffee. I did say that too, didn't I? Akatani chuckles nervously. Unbeknownst to them, that's the part of his quirk that he's most wary of sharing, for obvious reasons. So he settles for a half-truth as his explanation. For some reason, my quirk makes my taste buds different. I can't really eat food, but coffee is fine. Shinso's deadpan doesn't match his raised brow. Why yeah. Akatani swallows whatever lie he could come up with as an excuse since he can't think of anything that'd cover up the fact that it tastes close enough to blood. For some reason, he trails off again in hopes that they'll just drop it. Shinso seems to be accepting of the answer, relatable, giving a non-committable shrug. Todoroki on the other hand, not really. It's a bit strange. How can you be so blunt? Shinso shouts incredulously over the other boy's stoic mannerism, losing his own. The mood changed significantly. Akatani allows himself to laugh at their antics. Well, regardless, I'll admit that it felt good to get off my chest. He feels Eri cradled against it and returns her warm hug with one of his own. You all didn't judge me as harshly as I was expecting. Todoroki hums in mutual understanding from having shared his personal story while Shinso turns away from them to hide his embarrassment over having similar feelings. Whatever. The insomniac tries to play it off like no big deal with a wave over his shoulder. I've gotta get going now anyways. He walks slowly but surely towards the exit. See you around. Bye, Shinso, Akatani says on behalf of the trio that's made up of himself, Eri, and Todoroki. He then realizes the little girl in his arms is starting to get tired. Eri and I should probably head home too anyways. Unable to shake hands or bow with his sister occupying his arms, he flashes a smile instead. Thanks for coming, Todoroki. I know we just met, but I feel like we're already close friends. Of all things that could have taken Todoroki by surprise that day, it's hearing that which makes his heterochromic eyes widen. Friends. He tests the word on his tongue with a hesitance like it's foreign. After a moment of contemplating what that means, he asks, does that mean we should do this again? Akatani laughs again, if you want, mistaking the question as a request to continue attending support meetings. I'll bring Eri here again for sure, but you can also always come by Anteku during my shift. But he just so happens to be the embodiment of friendliness, fortunately for Todoroki. Taking that as an invitation, Todoroki nods. Okay. He hesitates before testing the unfamiliar word again, friend. Yeah, see you later, Todoroki. Akatani picks up on the unusual usage of the word that time. Rather than make it any weirder or awkward though, he teases Todoroki by tagging on at the end, fellow friend. Todoroki smiles as he watches the receding form of Akatani carrying Eri. The girl in the boy's arms with white hair reminds him of his siblings, making him pull out his cell phone to call his own sister. He waits for a few rings, hoping that she'll answer. Ironically, now that summer has ended, it's gotten warmer out. The sun shines down on Akatani and Eri as they stroll along the sidewalk. Birds sing melodies of hope and the wind blows so gently that not a leaf falls. For once, the two find peace and tranquility. Akatani is accustomed to this calm before the storm, but this time, he feels like it's truly as good as it's going to get. Akata Niai. Eri's muffled mumble comes from where she has her face nuzzled into the boy's chest. If not for his quirk heightening his hearing and other senses, Akatani would have not heard her. He looks at the tiny girl in his arms, reining in a laugh at how she looks like a baby ostrich burying its head in the sand. Switching her from one arm to the other so that the one he's been holding her with can get a break, he responds, yes, Eri, am I? Her soft voice starts to ask something but it trails off before she can finish. After a short pause, her face comes out of hiding to speak more clearly. Is my quirk villainous? She's still as quiet as a mouse but Akatani hears her anyways. Eri's question makes the boy stop in his tracks, his heart throbbing for her. Oh, Eri. He pulls her back into a hug in an attempt to comfort her. I don't know what your quirk is, but I can guarantee you that it's anything other than villainous. Hoping to cheer her up, he boops her on the tiny horn that sprouts from her forehead. It gave you this cute horn after all. Eri giggles at the affection. Her spirits successfully brighten. You're like a tiny unicorn. He laughs along. Eri's smile slackens when she gets a good look at the boy holding her though. She takes in his appearance, noting the effects of his quirk aren't present. But what about you? She innocently asks, you have tails and eyes but you say those are bad. Akatani's smile softens as well. No words able to come out of it to help her understand why they're so different. It's a little more complicated than that, he says instead. After ruffling her silky white hair, he proceeds to carry her down the sidewalk again. Don't worry about it. His emerald eye glimmers when it meets Eri's red ones. Like you said, my quirk keeps you safe, so it can't be all that bad. Eri nods in agreement before resting her head against the chest that she's been using as a pillow. You're my hero, Akata Niai. If he weren't worried about dropping her, Akatani would break down in hysterics. He can feel the tears tugging at the corners of his eyes like the strings connected to his heart. Maybe in another life, he would have allowed himself to collapse under the emotional wave. Rather than falling to his knees and crying though, he keeps his legs moving and his gaze on the girl who called him a hero. Thanks, Eri. His voice is damp even after he swallows some saliva in an attempt to dry it. I'm glad that I could be someone's. With her face buried, she can't see how seriously her earlier words affected him, so she gives no preamble to what she says next. Can I have a candy apple? Her childish question catches the boy completely off guard. Unable to contain his laughter over how sudden and random, but so Eri-like that request is, he has to hold her closer not to drop her while shaking from a giggle fit. Were you just trying to get on my good side for a candy apple? He teases. Nuo. Eri's stomach guiltily grumbles as she tries to deny his claim. Laughing still, but taking her hunger seriously, Akatani turns at the next corner. All right, we can swing by the shop for one. He's sure the girl is just as grateful as he is that Antic who isn't far from where they are now. Feeling her stir, rekindling energy that wasn't there before, he can sense her anticipation of the sugary sweet. Just one though. He has to remind her not to splurge. It's one of those occasions where he really does feel the responsibility of an older brother. He's become accustomed to bringing Eri along with him to Anteku. The store owner, Yoshimura, has too. He's welcomed the girl with open arms, offering pastries on the house at times. In a sense, he's like her surrogate uncle or grandfather. Akatani's smile slips and falls from his face when he sees who's waiting for him there instead though. A tall and slender man in an unkempt state stands outside the coffee shop, hands in the pockets of a baggy black outfit. The attire is strange enough, equipped with a utility belt and some kind of specialized scarf, that he could pose a problem. Just who I wanted to see. And that greeting does nothing to allay Akatani's concerns. The scruffy man turns to face them, but doesn't move just yet. I'm sorry, sir. We're closed. Akatani tries to handle the situation diplomatically first. However, he also sets Eri down just in case he needs his hands free. He makes sure to do so in a way that won't risk her being put in danger, placing her protectively behind him. The man notices the way the boy is guarding the younger girl before sighing in exasperation. He acts as though he can't be bothered to deal with the judgment. Yet, he does anyways, reaching into one of the pouches on his utility belt. He flashes his hero license for the boy to see he's not a threat. You can't make an exception for an underground hero. As much as Akatani is wowed by the reveal of the man's identity, he's admittedly just as scared. Why, you're Eraserhead. He recognizes the underground hero now that he's able to make the connection. Eraserhead's quirk is one that can render Akatani's own useless, no matter how powerful it is. He's one of the few heroes other than All Might that Akatani is fairly certain would be able to catch him. You know me. Eraserhead furrows his brows over a mere teenager recognizing him. Underground heroes purposely avoid attracting attention, so it's a wonder of its own how the boy knows him. Akatani swallows hard, not knowing how to respond at first. He eventually settles on, yeah, I used to be a big hero nerd. Used to be. Eraserhead snorts in mild amusement before shaking his head in lingering disbelief. Just don't expect an autograph, kid. Akatani jumps a little, being skittish and hearing such a suggestion too much for him to handle. Oh, that's okay. I don't need one. He forces out a pitiful laugh while trying to wave away the very implication that he'd want a signature. Remembering the original reason why he ran into the underground hero in the first place, he moves to unlock the door to Anteku. Oh yeah, you wanted to come in. He nervously glances over his shoulder while sliding the key in. Just for a bit. Eraserhead nods in affirmation. When Akatani holds the door open for him, he steps through the entrance and then slinks over to a booth. Thank you. Closing the door behind him and relocking it to avoid getting any other unexpected customers, Akatani asks, did you want anything in particular? Getting comfortable in the vinyl of the booth, Eraserhead rests his eyes for a moment by closing them. Just a coffee to go, please. Black. He then absent-mindedly places his order. That makes sense. Akatani nods as he turns on the coffee machine. While that begins brewing, he opens the display case to get Eri a caramel apple. An underground hero like yourself probably operates mostly at night. The little girl holds her hands out to take the candy apple once he places it on a plate. Here, Eri, you can go sit and I'll join you soon. He hands the dish to her with one hand while gently pushing her towards Eraserhead with the other. Eraserhead reopens his eyes to see Eri warily looking back at him. After some further coaxing from Akatani, she musters the courage to sit across from him. Is this your sister? The underground hero asks. Yeah, that's Eri. Akatani realizes that he hasn't quite introduced her or himself yet. Before he can give his own name though, the brewer beeps to let him know it's ready. He returns to preparing Eraserhead's coffee without saying more. Having a private moment with the little girl, Eraserhead takes it upon himself to try and not seem so intimidating. Hello, Eri. He hunches a little and awkwardly waves while introducing himself. I'm Shoto Aizawa. You can call me whichever you'd like. Considering his face is covered in stubble and his shoulder-length hair hangs over the rest, the underground hero doesn't entirely succeed at making himself less imposing. Yet, Eri strangely isn't as afraid as she normally would have been. Perhaps she's coming out of her comfort zone ever since meeting Shinso, Todoroki, and Toga. Or maybe she's just seen scarier that same day when Akatani used his quirk. Hello Aizawa. Eri doesn't quite get the pronunciation right with a mouthful of candy apple, but she tries returning the greeting with a polite one of her own. Aizawa blows air through his nose, the closest to a laugh as he'll allow. He then returns his attention to the off-duty barista that he's roped into working unpaid overtime. You two don't look related. Akatani almost spills the coffee that he's stirring, not having put a lid on the styrofoam to go cup just yet. Well. He searches for an excuse but is forced to surrender when he comes up empty. That's because we're not. Once the lid pops on, he carries the coffee over in order to join them in the booth. She's my adoptive sister, he says despite not having the proper paperwork. I see. Aizawa takes the coffee from Akatani but doesn't drink from it. Instead, he places the cup aside. Kid, he sighs as he prepares to say something else. Akatani tenses, anticipating nothing good. A moment passes where neither of them speak. Noticing the change in the boy's demeanor, Aizawa regrabs the coffee. I never got your name, and takes a sip from it to calm the atmosphere. Oh, Akatani shoots straight to sit upright upon remembering a second time that he hasn't introduced himself. It's Akatani Mikumo. He recovers afterward and tries to find an excuse while apologizing. Sorry for not saying so sooner. I was just a bit starstruck, I guess. Aizawa hums, having a mouthful of coffee before swallowing it down. Are you sure you weren't just surprised to see me? He asks. Akatani chuckles while nodding in agreement. Yeah, that too. Aizawa doesn't share in the boy's amusement though. He's transfixed on the coffee cup in his hand, not quite meeting Akatani's gaze, contemplatively tapping his pointer finger on the styrofoam. He still hasn't said what it is he actually wants to say. I'm going to be honest with you, Mikumo. His tone turns serious when he finally does meet the boy's eye. I didn't come here for the coffee. Akatani fights back the reflex to flinch, trying not to show any signs of his internal panic. He's not as good at keeping the worry out of his voice though. What did you come here for? The habit of stumbling over his words rearing its ugly head. Aizawa keeps his gaze forward as he says, look out the window to your right, making Akatani curious as to what it is he's supposed to see if he does. There seems to be nothing out of the ordinary when the boy turns his head to take a peek. Not until Aizawa gives him more specific instructions. Between the fire hydrant and the stop sign, Akatani sees through the tinted windshield of a parked car, a man in an overcoat and another with a head of fur behind the dashboard staring back. Who are they? He tears his gaze away from the window and returns it to the underground hero. Aizawa's answer sends shivers down Akatani's spine. One's an undercover officer and the other is a detective. The ceiling fan is off and none of the windows are open. The chill comes from a cold sweat. Why are they watching us? He hopes to sound oblivious, but he already knows the answer. Having finished her candy apple, Eri started listening in on the conversation. She too wears an expression of worry when Akatani asks, why are you telling me this? Aizawa sighs, not fooled by the act of ignorance. Shifting from a comfortable slouch, the underground fixes his posture to be one of preparation. I don't want you to do something stupid like trying to run away. Akatani allows himself to flinch that time. He had been planning on trying to escape as soon as he realized they found him. However, Aizawa has a fair point why that'd be a bad idea when he explains the reason why he'd pointed out the police. You're surrounded, Mikumo. Getting scared by the tension separated only by a table between them and the hero, Eri leans into her guardian for protection. Use your quirk, Akata Niai. She whispers into the shirt that she clings to. Her fistfuls of fabric make the boy acutely aware of the position she's placed in by being so close to him. Hearing Eri's desperate plea and seeing their sibling-like display of affection, Aizawa is quick to act. Before Akatani's can, the underground hero's eyes flare red. The harsh glow radiates the room, casting a shadow of the man's hair raising over his head. Don't use your quirk, the Eraserhead warns. Akatani swallows, knowing he doesn't have much of a choice. The underground hero's erasure has the boy feeling powerless. It's a feeling he barely remembers from his previous life. Why are you doing this? He helplessly hopes he can persuade the man to let them go now that he can no longer fight his way out. Why did you do what you did? Aizawa counters. His glowing glare hardens, unwavering, as he corrects himself. Why do you do what you still do? The question sends another shudder through Akatani. Realizing he hasn't been accused of a specific crime yet, he asks, what is it that you think I did? Not diverting his attention from Akatani the entire time, Aizawa reaches into the back pouch of his belt. While the underground hero's sight stays the same, the boy looks down at the table when a familiar mask is placed there. It's what I know you did, Mikumo. The burlap sack that once belonged to Sorimitsu Tabe of the Yakuza mocks Akatani with a stitched smile. Akatani places a palm against his face, covering his previously exposed eye. In the darkness, he sees the spacious void of his mind. As vast as it is, it's filled with panic. You're the Tokyo ghoul. Aizawa calls that headspace what it is. It's only when he asks, aren't you, that Akatani pulls himself out from it. Akatani lowers his hand, emerald eye looking into the red of Aizawa's. Why didn't you or some other hero take me in by surprise instead of doing whatever this is? He wonders which would have been a crueler punishment. He wonders which of the two he deserves more. Akatani startles when Aizawa's hair suddenly falls. Eraserhead just deactivated his quirk. The red glow has vanished, replaced by something more sympathetic. I wanted to give you the benefit of the doubt, he says with sincerity. The underground hero pulls out a tiny bottle of eye drops before applying them. Can you confirm something for me, Mikumo? And doesn't wait for Akatani to answer before continuing. You have no other choice but to eat human flesh. Am I correct? Akatani blinks back his surprise as he asks, how did you know? I've been tracking you for a while now. Aizawa pockets his eye drops before jumping into the explanation. When you first started, it was only once every few weeks. Then you tried blood from a blood bank. If you could get by with just that, then you wouldn't have reverted to your old ways. Realizing the underground hero is referring to the shy Hasekai, Akatani leans back into the vinyl of his side of the booth with a sigh. I only went after the Yakuza because of what they were doing to Eri. He grumbles his defensive reason loud enough for Eraserhead to hear. Aizawa raises a brow. You have no remorse for what you did to them. None. Both of the man's eyebrows furrow when he hears the boy's answer. Aizawa mimics Akatani's earlier movement, sinking into his side of the booth with a sigh. You're quite the problem child. He glances out the window towards his backup before returning his stare to the boy. Noticing the glance, Akatani asks, what are you going to do to me? He shoots a ghoulish glare as he guesses, put me in a cage. Hearing that her brother could possibly be locked up like she was, Eri springs out of his arms to shout across the table. No, don't do it, Aizawa. Her pleas startle Akatani more than Aizawa though. The underground hero keeps his composure as he gauges the pair. After a moment of silence where each side considers what the other may be thinking, he shifts to speak. Relax, I'm not going to do that. He first assures the little girl, then returns his attention to the boy. You're not an animal to be locked up. You're just a kid. Akatani's eyes widen in shock, not expecting to be let off the hook so easily. His guilty conscience disagrees with the hero's verdict. Tell that to the people I've killed. Tell that to who I've eaten. And he's fairly certain that he's not the only one who would be opposed to that judgment. Aizawa's sympathetic stare comes with more questions. Did you want to kill them, Mikumo? Would you have done so and devoured them if not for your quirk? Akatani thinks he doesn't deserve such sympathy, already knowing the answer to that first question. He's quiet as he considers lying, but decides to tell the truth. I wanted to kill the Yakuza. I wanted to kill the criminals and the villains. He admits his bloodlust with a heavy heart. I know that even if my quirk is meant to kill, it doesn't have to be used that way. I just chose to use it that way. Aizawa's brows raise, not expecting that from the boy. They lower as he reevaluates the situation, trying to come to the right conclusion based on the confession, but only because you needed them for consumption. No, Akatani shakes his head. I did it because I liked it. Aizawa glances out the window again, reminding himself and the boy of the not as equally considerate law enforcement waiting to take him in. Damn it, kid. I'm trying to help you. The underground hero hisses in a hushed tone, but Akatani just shakes his head again, a somber smile on his face. Sorry, Eraserhead. There's no helping me. He looks at his hands knowing there's already been plenty of blood spilled on them. I do get these animalistic urges, a desire. They clench into fists as his frustration with himself leaks out. In the beginning, I tried not to give in. After a while though, I got used to seeing the blood. I liked it. He knows he has an instinct that he can't resist sometimes. Part of me enjoys it. Aizawa looks at the coffee cup in his hand, feeling the warmth it radiates. He imagines no longer being able to taste that kind of satisfaction. He would have to find a new enjoyment. That's what the boy had done with what he was given. If I could erase your quirk so that you could eat a regular meal again, would you still be saying that? So he tries giving the boy something else to use as an alternative. Akatani's mouth hangs open in awe, nothing coming out of it while he's at a loss for words. When he finally finds them, he's still in a state of shock. You can do that? He wonders. Aizawa nods, fairly certain that he can. Akatani looks at Eri and the empty plate in front of her. To taste something sweet again. To enjoy an apple as much as she does. Do you mind? He has to ask if he really deserves that opportunity. He thinks of all the meals he would like to eat again and wonders if he actually can. I would like to make katsudon, but Aizawa waves away those concerns with a small stroke of his hand. Take all the time that you need. Nobody will make a move unless I give them a signal, alleviating the boy's worries by a significant margin. Akatani feels the hero's eyes on him when he begins preparing the food. He knows the man's quirk isn't active yet, but his mouth is already watering at the mere prospect of eating a normal meal again. When he seasons pork chops with salt and pepper, he's not that revolted by the smell of meat that isn't human flesh. When he beats an egg and coats the meat with a light dust of flour, he's looking forward to the taste and not worried about spitting it back out. He dips the pork in the egg and covers it with breadcrumbs. The yellow drizzle reminds him of blood spilling, his taste buds tingling. Akatani closes his eyes, trying to forget that last part. When the katsudon is finally finished, he sets the table with a plate for everyone. I made extra. It didn't feel right making something to eat by himself. Eri takes her utensils and digs in without complaint at least. Aizawa just sticks to drinking his coffee, sitting down to join them. Akatani isn't as hasty to take a bite. It's been so long. The last time he tried to eat something other than human flesh, he'd puked before becoming bedridden for days. He cautiously takes a fork and knife in each hand, as though they might stab him for trying to use utensils instead of grabbing handfuls of the meat like the animal he's become. When Akatani glances up at Aizawa, the underground hero nods. Eraserhead's quirk takes effect. The boy cuts himself a piece before sticking it with his fork. The bit of breaded pork chop is small, but he's still wary about putting it in his mouth. When he finally does, his emerald eyes begin to water as much as his taste buds. He's suddenly the crybaby kid under 4 again. Izuku Midoriya, for that short moment, gets to eat katsudon again. kid." Aizawa's voice is full of concern when he sees the boy breaking like a dam. "Are you okay?" Akata Niai. Eri stops eating her own food to wrap him in a hug once she sees he's crying. Not wanting to worry either of them, he wipes his eyes with his sleeves. "I'm sorry." He apologizes through sobs with a wobbly voice. "I just forgot how good it was." "Problem child," Aizawa says with a relieved smile. He leans back with a sigh before asking, "Would you like to eat more?" "Yes," Akatani shouts a little too eagerly, realizing he was too loud with his hasty response. He settles back into his seat with a more reserved response. I mean, yes, please." He doesn't try hiding his bashful blush as he starts scooping more into his mouth. "Just take it slow with small bites," Aizawa advises as he watches the boy eat like he's never had a meal in his life. In a sense, that may as well be the case, he figures. MMMHMM. Akatani makes a noise in response as he shoves more katsudon into his mouth. At this moment, the boy looks nothing like a ghoul. He looks just like a kid his age. Aizawa lets the teen enjoy his food for a while longer. He waits before ruining it by continuing their prior conversation. "We can continue doing this. I wouldn't mind. We can see if it'll satisfy your hunger and keep doing it so long as it works." Reminded of the offer, but also how he got to this point, Akatani pauses before taking his next bite. Thank you, but... He stares down at the food that had been otherwise foreign to him. "I'm offering you an alternative that only I can give. The detective I pointed out won't be so lenient if you decline my offer." Aizawa interrupts before the boy can talk himself out of the proposal. Akatani drops his fork, looking up at the underground hero. "So, an ultimatum. Stop hunting criminals for food and you'll let me be free." He's once again taken back by the amount of mercy he's being given. "Stop being the ghoul and you can live a somewhat normal life again." Aizawa nods. However, he knows deep down that even he won't be able to convince Naomasa to let it end there. He doesn't want to mislead the boy and lose his trust, so he ventures a little in the territory of what other punishments lay in wait. Of course, it won't be so straightforward. "You'll have to atone for what you've done somehow, and I'll need to meet with your parents." "My parents are gone," Akatani abruptly interrupts. He avoids making eye contact when the underground hero frowns. Define gone. Eraserhead deactivates his quirk as he sits up straight. The boy hesitates before saying, "Akatani Makumo isn't my real name." He doesn't lift his head just yet, still trying not to meet anyone's eyes, including Eri's, who tilts her head in confusion upon hearing his confession. Aizawa, on the other hand, isn't surprised. "I'm aware, aside from your job here and the apartment that you're renting, Akatani Makumo doesn't exist." He keeps his gaze on the boy despite his quirk no longer being in effect. He watches for a reaction that doesn't come. Akatani isn't that shocked that Eraserhead figured out his name is just an alias. After all, part of an underground hero's job is gathering information. "If I tell you stuff, will you agree not to look into my past anymore?" he asks instead of what else the man knows about him. Aizawa shakes his head before grabbing his coffee cup. "I can't promise that." "Sorry, kid." And taking a sip. "At least you're being honest." Akatani mumbles before finally lifting his head to meet Aizawa's gaze. He opens his mouth, closes it, reopens it, and then closes it again. Unable to look the hero in the eyes, he looks at the katsudon in front of him instead. "I first discovered my quirk when The katsudon makes him sick when it reminds him of that night long ago. I ate my mom." Christ. Aizawa nearly burns his tongue. He sets the coffee cup down as he takes that information in. He's almost too hesitant to ask, "And your father?" Akatani shrugs, unable to give a verbal response. Aizawa knows better than to pry any more than that, so he just sighs instead. While treading sensitive subjects, he may as well broach the next one. "I can't let you raise Eri alone when you're still a child yourself." He figures it's a good segue from the topic of parents at least. "You're going to take her away from me." Akatani's head shoots up in disbelief. "No, don't make me leave Akata Nai. Don't." Eri takes it worse. She clings to him like he's her lifeline. Inseparable if anyone were to try and take her. Aizawa feels his heart throb. He suddenly wishes he hadn't said anything. Then again, he knows it wouldn't have been any better to leave that part to Naomasa. "I'm sorry. There's nothing that can be done," is all he can manage to offer as condolence. "There must be. Please, you don't understand." Akatani shakes his head in denial as he returns the little girl's hug. His hold can't be too tight since it'll hurt her, but he desperately pulls her close. He treats her like a fragile treasure that's being threatened. "You're asking me to make a lot of exceptions, some of which I may be able to manage, but this most certainly isn't one of them." Aizawa hangs his head in a small bow meant to be taken as an apology for causing them so much hurt. "I can only do so much." No, Eri cries. Akatani runs a hand through her hair in a futile attempt to calm her. As he does so, he wonders if that'll be the last time he'll ever be able to touch her. "I really don't have a choice, do I?" He's starting to accept the reality of the situation. "No, sorry, kid." Aizawa tries to sound as soothing as possible while explaining. It's either this or you get taken too, which would mean not seeing her anymore anyways. Akatani nods, understanding that logic. He then looks back down at the girl wrapped in his arms. He takes a good look at her just in case it's his last. Will I at least be able to visit her? He hopes that it isn't. Maybe. Aizawa doesn't sugarcoat his uncertainty. I can try to arrange that. But he does offer them an ounce of hope if that'll help to ease their pain. Akatani blinks back the tears that threaten to spill before asking, Who would she be going to live with? She'd most likely be taken by an orphanage or some similar form of foster care. Aizawa answers, not content with that turnout. The boy lifts his head up to look Aizawa in the eye. Can I ask you one last thing? Aizawa sees how tired the boy is from the way his skin sinks under his eyes. The weary stare in them glazed over. Sure, kid. He returns the gaze with a similar one before asking, What is it? Akatani swallows, trying to think of the right words to say. I can tell you're a good guy. He knows from the sincerity that shines when the hero's eyes aren't glowing red. So, can you take Eri as her guardian? He sees the hero react with much anticipated shock, hurrying to justify his request with, I would feel better knowing she's with someone that I can trust. Kid. Aizawa trails off as he tries to think of how he can persuade the boy into changing his mind. I don't know if I'm cut out to be raising a child. Please, Eraserhead. Please. But the boy's green puppy eyes win in the end. No argument would be enough to tell the kid no. Geez, you really are problematic. How illogical. Aizawa slaps a palm against his forehead where he knows a migraine is bound to form. Fine, I'll do my best. And he starts massaging it to ease the tension before it can become overbearing. Thank you. Akatani smiles in relief. His smile quickly dissipates when he realizes he has to do something harder now. He has to convince the girl he's made his sister. He has to say goodbye, Eri. Eri shakes her head, already knowing he's about to try. No, I don't want to go. Her grip tightens and she presses into him harder as a form of protest. I know, Eri, I know. He holds her a little more loosely. I don't want you to go either. He knows he can't hold her any tighter for the same reason she has to go. He's too dangerous. But remember how I told you my quirk is villainous. Eri pulls her head back just enough to shout at Akatani without losing her grip. But you saved me with it. You said. And then turns to yell at Aizawa. You're the villain. Not a Katanii. Akatani pulls her back, trying to calm her down. Eri, it's not his fault. He shoots Aizawa an apologetic look before looking into Eri's eyes. He's a real hero. He'll be able to take care of you better than I can. But Eri is still in denial, bottom lip quivering. Who's going to keep me safe if you're not there? The tears ebbing at the corners of her eyes start to run down her cheeks. Wanting to stay strong for her, Akatani fights to hold his back. Don't worry, the bad men won't bother you ever again. I made sure of it. He tries to sound confident in order to be assuring. And I'll always be around. I'll come see you from time to time. But I want to stay with Akatani. She presses her face into his chest, tears wetting his shirt. Don't cry, he whimpers while trying not to cry too. This isn't goodbye. I promise I'll see you again. He closes his eyes to prevent them from spilling. But he wants to see her as much as he can in these final moments. He promise. But he can't let this be the last time he sees her either. For Eri's sake, he has to promise her it won't be the last time. Akatani opens his eyes so he can tell her, I promise. The sun had long since set, lights in the top floor apartment a clear indication of someone being home. So why the occupant doesn't respond to Himiko Toga's shrill shout of his name, Akatani, as drawn out as it may be, still remains a wonder to her. The blonde raps her knuckles against the door, not for the first time, as she leans an ear to it. Despite receiving no response after yet another failure, she remains firmly planted at the welcome mat. Her next whine isn't any less indignant. Come on, I know you're home. Only when she follows it with a threat. Don't make me bust the door down. Does she finally get a response? It's open. Akatani speaks at a much lower decibel, making the girl's straining worthwhile. Himiko balks at the revelation, really, before actually trying the knob. When it turns and the door swings open, she shakes her head in further exaggerated disbelief. That's not a good way to prevent robberies, you know. She shuts the door behind her as though to emphasize her point. Akatani doesn't play along. His energy dwindled to the point of non-existence. He's sprawled across his couch in a pair of black shorts and a white t-shirt, one arm hanging loosely over the side that his hand touches the floor. His voice still low enough to be a whisper. What are you doing here, Himiko? He lazily draws a question. Though admittedly surprised by the boy's attitude, Himiko isn't wavered by it. She has a pep in the steps that carry her over to his bedside. I went to Anteku to surprise you, but your boss said you called in sick today. She then hoists up a shopping bag that Akatani had failed to notice earlier, so I brought you some medicine. Himiko pauses, seemingly noticing the drugs she bought the same time he does. Before he can even get the chance to sit up and sift through the bag's contents himself, she's already doing her own rummaging. Oh, wait. Does medicine taste bad to you too? She recalls the side effect of the ghoul's quirk as she searches for something to give him. It tastes bad for everyone anyways. Taking the bag from her, Akatani sets it on the floor in a particular spot where nobody will trip over it. I'm not sick. That was just an excuse to not have to work. He finally raises his voice to a normal frequency so he can quell any concerns for his health. That isn't like you. Himeko tilts her head in confusion. She hadn't expected that of him. She just as quickly dismisses the lie to his boss though, concern shifted to other matters. You owe me 800 yen then. She gestures to the medicine she bought before glancing around the apartment. Where's Eri? Reminded of the real reason for his sudden reclusiveness, Akatani plops back down onto the cushioning of his couch. He may as well rip it off like a band-aid and tell it to her straight, he figures. The heroes and police found me. He closes his eyes in anticipation of what he's sure will be a rambunctious response. You let them take her. His expectations are met when Himeko shouts incredulously at him. It didn't take her long to connect the dots and realize the reason for Eri's absence based on the bomb he dropped. He really doesn't want to deal with this right now. He's already trying to process what happened himself and his own emotions. He heaves out a heavy sigh, sinking deeper into the couch, hoping that it'll swallow him up. When it doesn't, he forces himself to open his eyes in order to fix Himeko with a hard stare. What else was I supposed to do? He genuinely wants to know what other choice he had in the matter. Himeko throws her hands up in the air. Whether the gesture be because she feels the answer is obvious or that she herself doesn't know is only unclear for a mere moment. Fight them. Rip them apart. Something. Her suggestions fly out with swipes of her hands that make her spiral and fall on the couch beside Akatani. He shakes his head with what minimal energy he can muster. It was a hero, not the Yakuza. What's the difference so long as they're trying to take Eri from you? Himeko crosses her arms under her small bust as she challenges Akatani on his excuse. He glances up at her in disbelief, taken aback by the sincerity in her tone. He'd forgotten about this side to her. Himeko had proven a few times that she can be a bit intense. He just hadn't expected her to suggest he kill heroes on top of criminals. He was certain that they agreed a line must be drawn somewhere. The difference is that the Yakuza wanted to hurt Eri. This hero wants to help. He assumes that she's just being protective of the little girl. But when he sees the same sincerity in her eyes as she says, Akatani, you should know by now that heroes don't want to help people like us. He knows it's more than having an attachment to Eri. For her, it's personal. Akatani's brows furrow, his frustration leaking into his expression. It's not like he doesn't care about Eri too. It's just that he trusts heroes a little more than she does. Deep down inside, he's still a hero otaku. Plus, he had a fair amount of time to get acquainted with Eraserhead. This one is different. I can tell. He knows not all heroes are like All Might. Good or bad as that comparison may be. Himeko huffs, still not taking him seriously. Does your quirk make you psychic too now? Her sarcastic remark has Akatani sitting up to address her on a more personal level, wanting to be taken seriously and for his word to hold some merit. Akatani recalls the incident more vividly. He could have erased my quirk, Himeko. A SWAT team could have shot me full of tranquilizers, or a team of heroes could have overpowered me before I even knew what happened. They had the element of surprise. The hardness in his tone is its own sincerity. Hearing how easily he could have been captured, Himeko lowers her guard a little. Her eyes soften and she uncrosses her arms, thinking about how close of a call Akatani being cornered truly was. So why didn't they? Her voice wobbles as it sways between anger and sorrow. Seeing how difficult it is for her to process the news, Akatani takes Himiko's hand in his own as an attempt to comfort her. He wanted to talk to me first. He wanted to give me a chance. He gives her hand a soft squeeze to let her know he's still there for her. If that's not a real hero, then I don't know what is. Himeko looks as though she wants to say more, continue trying to dispute the decision to hand Eri over, but refrains. Instead, she admits defeat as well. Her shoulders drop and her head hangs, so that's it. You're just giving up. Seeing the fight drain from her system, Akatani allows his own to fade. Like I said, a hero has her. She's in good hands, probably better than mine. His gaze falls to he and Himiko's intertwined fingers. Why are you so opposed? Himeko stares off into the distance, looking at nothing nor no one in particular. Heroes take away the things I want. When her eyes return to Akatani, he lifts his head to meet them, the things that I love. The boy blushes at the slight confession, but forces himself to maintain eye contact as she continues speaking. They took Eri away, and they almost took you too. Love. Akatani nearly chokes on the word. He pulls away and coughs into the hand that he was using to hold Himiko's. Whatever. They let me off the hook. Sorta. He shakes his head to clear away any romantic thoughts and returns the conversation to its original point of origin. My point is that you don't have to worry about them locking me up and Eri is just as free. Himeko blinks in reaction to his reaction. Having already had one intense conversation for the day though, she decides to save that one for another time. What do I need to worry about then? She sighs while standing up. You're going to make me stress eat. She travels from the couch to the kitchen while asking, you still have food in your fridge? Though the topic of discussion is no longer about heroes, Akatani isn't quite able to forget about Eri. After all, she's the only reason why the place is stocked with ordinary food. And the cabinets. Help yourself. He falls back onto the couch with just as heavy a heart as he had when Himiko first intruded. Himiko raids the fridge while saying, I'm no hero, but I want to help you, Akatani, and returns with a bright red apple, Eri's favorite. If the heroes can take Eri, then let me take you away. Yeah. She takes a bite from the fruit once she arrives back at the couch. Having already exhausted what energy he could muster to argue with her, he isn't prepared for what the blonde has up her sleeve now. Akatani lolls his head to the side, eyelids drooping just as much. What do you mean? There's a glimmer in the blonde's eye that wakes Akatani back up. Instead of laying around here sulking all day, let's go on a date. She holds out her free hand for him to take. Akatani pauses just as he's about to grab it. A D-date. He'd like to blame his short-circuited brain on being drowsy, considering they'd already been on one before according to her. Himiko finishes the reach for him and takes his hand in hers. Yeah, it'll cheer you up. I don't know, but the boy is still much too reluctant to move just yet. Himiko tugs on his arm, trying to get him to budge. Come on, it'll be fun. But to no avail. Only when the blonde resorts to violence by throwing her apple at his head does he give in. All right, fine. He groans like an old man with weak knees as he stands up to go. But of course, their date night is that of two teens. They're young and full of vigor, nor are they ordinary. Roaming rooftops brings them closer to the stars. Spring in their step carries them from building to building. Akatani's mask warms his face when the cool breeze brushes through his hair. The type of thrill that they get from this above-average form of Parker is greater than any simple type of outing. There's nothing quite like a hunt to a predator, even if Akatani is no longer allowed to eat his quarry. There's something about the actual action of instinct. When they come across a purse snatcher who's completely oblivious to their stalking, there's no comparison to that kind of euphoria. The ghoul drops from above, tentacles wrapping the prey using powerful suctions. Momentum of the strike throwing coils around the victim's body. The red limbs constrict, going for a quick suffocation. They squeeze. Every time the prey exhales, they squeeze a little more tightly. Himiko doesn't even get a chance to do anything herself. She draws back and watches as Akatani handles the purse snatcher himself. Normally, she'd be content with doing so. It's enticing to her to watch the ghoul hunt. However, this is notably different from those other times. He's not enjoying it himself. Not truly. There's something smaller than the red speck in his Kakugan which spurs him on. Akatani always hunts with aggression. The release of rage is always evident. Except, there's no burst of agony this time. Blood doesn't spill and none of that sorrow is shed. He nearly rips the purse snatcher apart, but he stops himself. He holds back for the sake of the promise he made to Eraserhead. The thief is rendered unconscious instead, let off easy. Acts of vigilantism, regardless of restraint, is sure to still cause him trouble. And yet, it's not even worth it to him. As he leaps from roof to roof with Himiko in search of another criminal to vent through, he feels just as empty as he did when leaving his apartment. Himiko spends the rest of the night in a similar state of unrest. She studies Akatani rather than joining in, no longer having any fun either. However, there's no knowing what the ghoul's face looks like as he does all this. There's no telling what sort of sad expression he's making. Nobody knows when he has a mask to hide it. Anteku's wooden floor had aged, its boards creaking under the pressure of every step. Even though it's just another routine day at the coffee shop, Akatani can't help but feel although he's being trampled upon just the same. The passing customers don't demand much, just for him to pour coffee from a silver pot into their blue onion flower cups arrayed at each table. Yet, the tin feels heavy enough in his hand to be a dumbbell. The young barista absent-mindedly places a dessert plate decorated with a caramel flan on one of the tables. He'd normally be anxious under the anticipation of waiting on Eraserhead given ordinary circumstances. But his excursion last night has him extra stressed. If the underground hero found out he's still operating as a vigilante, regardless of restraint, he worries that he'd really no longer be able to see Eri. Every time the door chime indicates another customer, Akatani's head swivels to see if it's the little girl and her new guardian. He instead notices what's playing inaudibly from a television mounted above the checkout counter. It's across the way from where the boy is currently standing so that he can see it at the perfect angle. What's being shown has him just as entranced as he was with his own thoughts. The morning news covers a story about Japan's most prestigious hero school. Apparently, the UA barrier was destroyed, or rather, it was disintegrated. Already, Akatani speculates the reasons and possibilities as to how or why. It had recently been announced that All Might began teaching there. A reporter or member of the paparazzi could have simply wanted to get a big scoop. However, there's always the concern of more sinister motives. Before the boy can get too lost in thought, his mind is returned to its original focus. The door chime alerts him to their arrival before he hears Eri's gleeful, "Akata Niai." That's the only warning he gets before a little blur covers the span of the cafe to slam straight into his legs. Overwhelmed with an equally delighted emotion, Akatani can't help but laugh with somewhat relative relief. It's from an awkward angle that he has to bend down at the waist, but he happily returns the little girl's hug. "I missed you too, Eri." The smile on his face is genuine as he takes in her presence, as though they'll take her away from him again. He lifts his head to check on the others that came through the door. Aizawa isn't alone. Accompanying him is the detective, Naomasa. Akatani eyes them for a moment, lowering his voice for Eri alone. "Have they been treating you well?" When he feels Eri nod against his legs, the rest of him loosens. The tense tightening of his shoulders lets them drop a little. Whether it's because the detective heard or saw Akatani's concern for the girl, nobody can be sure. It's his job to be perceptive. Naomasa tries to reassure the boy with a smile. She's in good hands. It's the best attempt at comfort that he can offer. But Akatani isn't in the best of moods to perceive it as an attempt of peace. "I didn't ask you." His words have a bite to them that reminds the detective of how animalistic the boy can be. That the young barista isn't an average teenager. He's the Tokyo ghoul. Aizawa takes a step forward, the foot meant to be put in between the two opposing sides of law each one represents. She's safe. His assurances seem to reach Akatani instead of the detectives. Suddenly, it's a reminder that he is the one caring for Eri and not Naomasa, putting Akatani at ease. "You can trust us." Aizawa's eyes meet the boy's to let him know that he's sincere. Akatani holds Eri closer to him anyways. Having her there in his arms helps to calm his nerves. But he still can't help but shake his worries. Not after what the television showed. "The UA barrier. I saw on the news." He starts to vocalize his concern but gets stopped short. "Everything's under control." Aizawa is quick to allay Akatani's worry yet again. He sounds so sure of himself. Akatani remembers that the man is not just a pro hero, but a teacher at the hero school too. He's on the front lines in both potentially dangerous scenarios. But it's because of that lifestyle that Akatani is worried in the first place. Is it? She could have been hurt. He doesn't want to consider what would have happened if somebody malicious had broken into a place to hurt children. Aizawa's eyes narrow just the slightest bit. The slight glare makes Akatani realize how hypocritical he's being. It's not like his own vigilante lifestyle had given Eri the safest living environment. UAS Teacher's Lounge is one of the safest and most secure places she can be. He makes a fair point that heroes are there to protect her as well. But Aizawa isn't looking him in the eye anymore. Naomasa looks over at the underground hero with a bit of surprise, then back at Akatani. The motion doesn't go unnoticed. The detective sighs before saying, "Come on, Aizawa. The kid doesn't need my quirk to know that was a lie." Aizawa's stare switches to Naomasa. "It wasn't." And that makes the detective pause momentarily. Naomasa waits a second before shaking it off. Then, he explains, "The barrier being destroyed so that the paparazzi and reporters could get in wasn't an accident. We're investigating whether this deliverance was malicious or just for the sake of some lucky scoop on All Might." And Akatani is grateful for him not sugarcoating the truth at the very least. Aizawa hangs his head, ashamed for having hidden that truth from the boy who had entrusted Eri to him. Having it out in the open now, it was a declaration of war. A distraction. He shares his own outlook on it. Naomasa raises a brow in the underground hero's direction. "I thought taking care of a child would get you to drop your conspiracy theory hobby. I don't think it's just a conspiracy." It did seem strange. Akatani defends Aizawa's reasoning with his own suspicions. Seeing the detective isn't quite as easily convinced, Aizawa elaborates. "In all the years UA has prospered, has it ever once been infiltrated like today?" His question makes Naomasa swallow whatever retort had been on the tip of his tongue prior to that thought. The detective considers that factor. However, it's something that'll have to be mulled over in his office and not a coffee shop. Enough. This isn't something to be discussed in front of civilian children. He ends it there before he and Aizawa overshare something important about the investigation. Especially since, and I'm saying that lightly when not taking other components into account, Akatani has his own criminal record. He stares at the boy, not seeing a hint of ghoulish evil hidden in him. "No offense." Akatani shrugs impassively. "None taken." Interjecting herself into the conversation now that it's essentially ended, "Akata Niai." Eri tentatively looks up at the boy she's latched onto, his smile returning to put her at ease. Akatani looks down to meet her gaze. "Yeah." His voice is much softer with her than it was with the adults. But Eri still hesitates. She shyly looks away before requesting, "Can you tell Todoroki Niai and Shinso-sen I said hi?" Akatani's eyes widen briefly, surprised by the affectionate nicknames she had given their friends. It seems that he isn't the only one that she's missed seeing. His smile wobbles a bit as he holds back tears. "I sure can." And he ruffles her hair much to her dismay. Listening in, Aizawa's own eyes widen in shock as well. He recognizes the names of the boys Eri mentioned, one of which is a student in his class. He's not sure what their connection to the boy and girl is, but as curious as he is, he decides to let it go for now. The rest of Eri's visit to Antiku is a lot more enjoyable for her and Akatani. The mood takes a more lighthearted tone when Yashimura joins in on the reunion. They enjoy each other's time and company, not taking any of it for granted. But sooner or later, it ends. Eri leaves with Aizawa and Akatani is left alone again. All he has after she's gone to remember her by is the promise he made to her. He goes to the Quark support group so that he can keep his word. As expected, the coffee machine in the hallway is where he runs into Shinso first. "I thought I'd find you here." He jokingly greets the fellow insomniac and coffee addict. Shinso steps aside so that Akatani can fish his own canned coffee from the vending machine. "I should be saying that to you." When Akatani's back is turned, Shinso allows a lazy smile to cross his face. "Long time, no see." Hearing Shinso, Akatani scratches the back of his head as though he'll be able to dig out a proper excuse for his absence. "I've been a bit busy," is all he manages to come up with. Shinso shrugs like he doesn't care, though he probably secretly does. It helps him to avoid being accused of having affection by blaming the other boy Akatani came to see. Todoroki barely comes around anymore either. "I think he was a little disappointed that I was the only one showing up." Hearing that and remembering his last conversation with Todoroki, having promised to see him again during sessions here, Akatani feels a pang of guilt in his chest. "I'm a terrible friend, aren't I?" His body sinks with his sulking voice by literally sinking. "But a better brother." Shinso tries to cheer him up, not knowing better of Akatani's current situation. "Speaking of which, where is Eri? She's normally attached to your leg." He glances around in search for the little girl. Akatani's demeanor doesn't quite change aside from mild fidgeting as he searches for a proper response. He eventually lands on, "Her dad wanted to see her." A technical half-lie considering Aizawa had to adopt her. He pulls from his own family history to make it a little more believably personal. He lives in America, so. Shinso solemnly nods as he takes in the lie, believing it. "I get it." His consoling expression makes Akatani feel all the more guilty for withholding the truth. "You probably already miss her." Is it that obvious? But there's no need to lie about that. "Well," Shinso hides his face with his canned coffee. "Don't forget you have, friends that are here for you." Taking a sip afterwards so Akatani can't see his blush. Taken aback by Shinso's rare show of affection, Akatani is startled into silence. He cracks open his own coffee before also taking a sip, sharing the boy's embarrassment. "Anyways, Eri wanted me to tell you, before she left, that she said hi." He averts his eyes before adding, "You and Todoroki go to UA, right?" Shinso lowers his coffee, stopping from taking another sip. "Yeah." He's surprised by the question, but dismisses it just as quickly, "Except I'm in Gen Ed. Remember." He presumes Akatani is just curious about the hero course. "Never mind that. But Akatani surprises him yet again. Shinso waits to hear the rest, curious as to what this could be about. "Be careful." He certainly wasn't expecting a warning. That's not ominous at all. Shinso raises a brow that gives him an expression oddly reminiscent of Aizawa. Akatani swallows despite having not taken another sip of coffee. The UA barrier being destroyed. He hesitates before explaining his reason for concern. "I don't think that it was coincidental." He pauses one last time before trying to smooth it over. "I'm just saying to be cautious is all." Shinso continues to stare at Akatani, skeptically, perhaps even warily. Then he mumbles thanks, still not quite sure what the boy means. "I don't know how or why you know that." His eyes meet Akatani's. "But you be careful too." It started as a tapping, little flicks against the glass shielding Akatani from the outside. As the sky darkened with storm clouds, however, the spears of water became thicker. Rain now rattles the windows as the droplets yell at him. He doesn't know if it's some sort of animalistic instinct, but it almost sounds as though nature is warning him. The world is trying to tell him something that he would only know soaked by the cold touch of darkness and not hidden away in the warm comfort of Antiku. He remembers what it's like. Water running down his face like tears, his hair matted and damp, clothes drenched, the blood pouring down on him like the rain, and the only difference between the two being one's cool sting versus the other's warm stick. Akatani shakes his head to clear away those thoughts. The urge to feel the liquid on his skin again still lingers, the desire to taste it. He runs his tongue along his chapped lips, suddenly aware of how dry they are. Akatani drinks some of the coffee that he's supposed to be selling, hoping that it'll be enough to quench his thirst. He hopes that the only reason he's parched is because of the monsoon right outside the cafe. The ghoul knows that's not the truth though. That's just an excuse. Akatani knows what's actually happening. He hasn't told Eraserhead. He's not quite sure he wants to even admit it to himself. The erasure meals aren't working. They do, for a while. However, it's a more temporary fix than previously presumed. There are two problems. The first is that he's not satisfied with regular food anymore. He had thought having his taste buds return to normal would be the best thing that could happen to him. But it's comparable to having vegetables when he could be enjoying a big slice of chocolate cake. His mouth has developed a craving for flesh. The second issue is a much more concerning matter. Akatani is fairly certain that the erasure has only been increasing his appetite for flesh and blood. Eating an average meal does satisfy his hunger just like any other person. However, just like any other person, he gets hungry again later. Except, it seems his hunger is tenfold. He no longer feels famished, but very much starved. He's been checking the clock during his shifts, and he's also willing to bet that the intervals in between meals before he gets hungry again has been drastically dropping in time. It went from losing minutes to hours. Akatani's nails dig into the counter like a set of claws, scratching at the wood. He feels like a caged animal. He's suddenly aware of how trapped he is. The pounding on the window is the wild stone jungle he'd familiarized himself with as a hunting ground. Now he waits for his meals to be brought to him and served. He impatiently growls, teeth gritted and grinding. Aizawa hadn't shown up for lunch, which is annoying. Yet, he understands the man teaches at UA during the day. It's excusable and understandable. What's as frustrating as it is equally concerning is that the underground hero should be able to manage bringing dinner during his night shift. Akatani checks the clock again. Eraserhead is running late. He's never late, and this is by far later than usual if there is such a thing as late. The rainstorm suddenly feels like a much worse omen than it previously did. If the ghoul really does have such a thing as instinct based on nature's weather, then that means something bad must have happened. Akatani starts mulling over the possibilities for Aizawa's tardiness. It could be something as simple as his duties being a teacher. Perhaps he had to hold a student after class, or the principal called for a meeting. Maybe he needed tending to. Akatani would be forgiving of the man's tardiness if the reason is parenthood for his technically adopted sister. The worst outcome comes to mind as well, though. There's a chance that something bad happened. Eraserhead is an underground hero who fights criminals and villains alike. Akatani's pupils contract. Red veins begin to stem from his eyes. He stares hard at nothing in particular, an angry glare he wishes he had something to fixate on. The pressure of his fingers pressing into the cashier counter start causing it to splinter, nails carving into the wooden structure. His heart beats in his chest like a drum, loud enough to be the thunder that the storm outside is missing. The ghoul begins to worry about the safety of the pro hero who's taken Eri under his wing. If Aizawa is in danger, the protective older brother worries that his sister could be in trouble by extension. Akatani seethes through his teeth, biting back a feral shout that he wishes he could direct at whoever dares endanger it. The door chime brings Akatani back to reality, his mind reeling with his body as he jumps back. When he releases his grip on the counter, wood shavings fly up in the air with his hand. His pupils dilate until they're back to normal, and the veins bulging from his eyes recede just as quickly. His flow of black hair whips to the side when he turns his head to see who entered the shop, the locks still covering one side of his face. He's surprised to see Naomasa instead of Aizawa, the detective's overcoat drenched from the monsoon. Judging by Naomasa's expression, the man is as equally disturbed as the boy. His rectangular eyes meet Akatani's, a solemn silence communicating what the boy already knows. Akatani would cry, but the storm is already shedding enough tears for him with its downpour of rain. Where's Eraserhead? Akatani asks the question anyways, though he knows the answer, though he doesn't want to hear it confirmed. In his mind, rationally, there would be no other reason for the detective to come see him instead. Naomasa looks off to the side, breaking eye contact. There was an incident. He begins. His words are slow. He's treading lightly, so as not to spook a wild animal. Akatani tenses anyways. The wet squelch of the detective's shoes on the floor alerts Akatani to the man's attempt at subtly moving closer. When Naomasa sees the boy flinch back, he stops. The next few seconds that pass aren't quite a standoff. However, there is tension radiating between the two. It makes Naomasa hesitate. He's never sure of himself when in the presence of the ghoul. He never knows how to interact with a boy who's also capable of creating the crime scenes he's seen. You don't have to come, but he's requesting to speak with you. But those words must be the right ones to have said. Akatani's visible eye widens, the green within glowing with childlike hopefulness. There's an unspoken stutter from the boy's end that he tries to cover up, but Naomasa notes it in his memory. When Akatani recovers, he speaks with a hardened resolve that doesn't quite make it to his gaze. Take me to him. Akatani had assumed the worst. The storm, Aizawa's absence, Naomasa's arrival, the unelaborated incident that the detective spoke of. It all pointed to another person leaving his life. Not just his, but Eri's, who needs the underground hero most. He sighs to nobody in particular, frustration and relief blending like gasoline and water. Now he's in a police cruiser headed for UA. Neither of the two locations did he ever think he'd be in, let alone for the reasons that he is and will be. His gaze falls to his lap. Not quite sure of where to look in the vehicle and unwilling to stare at Detective Naomasa, but he is, at the very least, still willing to speak. He wants to know more about what happened, even if he's already conjured up his own resolution in his head. Does this have to do with the barrier being broken? Akatani nervously fidgets with his fingers. Akatani can feel Naomasa's eyes on him, the detective taking his eyes off the road momentarily to glance over at the boy. He had been kind enough not to stick Akatani in the back, allowing him to sit up front in the passenger seat. Something about the equal sitting up front is an assurance that this isn't an arrest. Yes, a group of villains broke into the USJ during a class trip there. Akatani stops fiddling with his hands and lifts his head to return the detective's gaze upon hearing that. But Naomasa has already returned his attention to the road, saying the rest. The barrier was a distraction for them to steal a schedule. Naomasa's grip on the steering wheel tightens. Aizawa's theory was right all along. You two were right to think something was suspicious. Akatani can sense the frustration coming from the man, radiating in wafts of smell through his sweat. The ghoul picks up on Naomasa's feelings through more than just his words. You couldn't have known for sure. Don't blame yourself. Akatani tries consoling the detective as best as he can without touching him. He's not up to a hug or anything, and he doubts Naomasa is either, especially considering they're in the middle of driving right now. But he does want to try to be of some consolation. He can tell that the detective is genuinely trying his best. Naomasa huffs, not really valuing the boy's words. He does appreciate the gesture though, thanks, kid, offering a small smile in return. Akatani can tell that it's fake, having utilized false faces before himself, but he doesn't say anything more. When the unlikely duo finally reaches UA, Naomasa leads Akatani to the medbay, not the nurse's office. Where he's at is a room not likely meant for students, one reserved for overnight patients with more severe or critical cases, like Eraserhead. When Akatani sees Aizawa, he's not even sure that the man is the underground hero at first. So many bandages wrap Aizawa head to toe that his face is practically concealed in gauze. Akatani's fingers curl into his palm, nails cutting into the skin of his hand that's now clenched as a fist. Who did this to you? He can't suppress the shaking in his voice as well as he can the tremors of his body. Luckily, the detective and the underground hero mistaken the reason as worry and not rage. Naomasa sees Aizawa struggling to speak, so he hands the teacher a glass of water while answering for him. They called themselves the League of Villains. Akatani's not sure if the next bit is a jab at him or if it's meant to be a joke, friends of yours. But he takes the question rather personally of an insult. Can't say they are. The venom in his tone has Naomasa swallowing at the same time Aizawa takes a sip of water. Akatani then momentarily redirects his attention, noticing a certain absence in the room. His head swivels left and right as he scours the area before asking, "Where's Eri?" Having wetted his vocal cords, Aizawa takes the chance to answer that one. "Don't worry, she was here at the teacher's lounge with all might." Akatani's heart beats quicker at the mention of the number one hero. She was nowhere near the attack. Hearing Eri was under the care of the world's strongest hero puts Akatani at ease. But he quickly recovers from his starstruck stupor to emphasize, "Where is she now though?" With his ashy, Aizawa pauses when he realizes his mistake before correcting himself. I mean present Mike. Akatani inwardly beams at the mention of another hero, but doesn't let himself outwardly show any signs of excitement. Aizawa takes the stoic disposition as a sign of skepticism. "Don't worry, Mike is a close friend of mine. He can be trusted with her." Aizawa purposefully doesn't mention Nimiri's involvement though. He's not sure how the ghoul would react to his little sister being watched by an R-rated heroine. Not that Nimiri would influence a girl Eri's age. Akatani allows himself to relax a little bit at that, knowing that Eri is safe. He suddenly feels like a storm drain, the downpour outside knocking him down into a cushioned seat at Aizawa's bedside. "Kid," the wounded hero grunts when he tries to sit up. Naomasa also moves with a concerned demeanor, but Akatani waves them both off, dismissing their worries. "Thank you." He can tell that Aizawa is making a confused expression by the way the bandages around his face crease and fold. So he elaborates, "For not bringing her to the USJ. He's not sure what he would have done if Eri were harmed. Or worse, for what it's worth. I'm glad that I didn't either." Aizawa rests his eyes by closing them. His body sinks back into the cushioning of the hospital bed's mattress. He seems just as relieved. Akatani then realizes just how exhausted each and every one of them truly are. Naomasa slumps into a chair on the opposite side of Akatani and Aizawa, almost defeated in tune. They both look like they've taken a beating. Akatani supposes Aizawa has in a literal sense. These are the two that he entrusted to Eri. It's not that he doesn't see they clearly tried, but Akatani starts to regret his decision. He regrets decreasing his activity as the ghoul. Maybe he would have noticed the significant decrease in villain activity leading up to a league of them. He could have potentially seen the attack on USJ coming, and maybe he would have participated in it. Akatani rests his head in his hands, the thought weighing heavily on him. He wonders if he actually would have been a part of the villain attack had Eraserhead not found him. Not with Eri. He knows that if he hadn't handed her over to them, then he wouldn't have gotten involved with villains. He wonders if he would have become one without her though. He wonders what kind of path that he was on before. Naomasa called him a vigilante, but Toga had called him a villain. According to society, there isn't very much of a difference between the two categories. If all he wants is to help himself to a huge meal like the Yakuza, then an entire class of students wouldn't have been a bad place to pick up from where he left off. Akatani shakes his head, letting his hands fall from his face. He knows that he's not thinking rationally, that he's just hungry. It's his ghoulish cravings talking, not him. When he begins to starve, he doesn't care who it is that he devours, he'll just eat. Like when he ate his mother. He knows that if he hadn't met Aizawa, he would have just stuck to eating villains. Maybe the League would have been victims to the ghoul long before the attack on USJ could have taken place. Kid, Aizawa's voice sounds distant, so far away that it's barely worth calling a whisper. Kid, but the repetition is a little louder that time. It's enough to pull Akatani from the depths of his thoughts so that he doesn't drown in the ocean that the storm outside had made. When he breaks the surface, he gasps for air. He sees Aizawa and Naomasa staring at him expectantly. For what, he doesn't know. His breath hitches and he shivers from the cold that seems to have worked its way inside. I asked if you're hungry. He certainly wasn't expecting to hear that. Aizawa's tone is as soft as his bloodshot eyes, though. It's not accusatory. It's not harsh or reprimanding. The underground hero is genuinely asking out of concern. Akatani's stomach growls in response, making him blush. He's not sure what gave him away before his body betrayed him, but he nods in embarrassed admittance. Yeah, but you're in no condition to. He tries denying the offer anyway since he knows the process is strenuating for the hero. There's some leftovers from the cafeteria that you can have. Naomasa can get it for you. But Aizawa is quick to cut Akatani off. Sure. Naomasa nods before pushing off with his knees to stand up. Sit tight while I get you some grub, kid. His overcoat gets discarded, hung over the chair's back to dry, before he heads for the sliding door. Akatani is about to make another attempt of refusal, but he doesn't have to when the nurse makes her entry from the other side of the door. He recognizes her as Recovery Girl, a short older lady who uses a cane to hobble in. What's this I hear about using your quirk? Naomasa is amazed by the woman's acute skill of deduction considering they didn't mention Aizawa's quirk per se. The way that the elder heroine uses her cane as a third leg makes Akatani view her as a wounded animal, the limp mimicking the loss of a fourth limb. Despite her mild handicap, she still manages to close the distance between the entrance and Aizawa's bed rather quickly. Didn't I tell you that you received damage to your eyes? Her tiny head shakes in disapproval as she starts to remove the gauze around his face. I haven't even changed your bandages yet. When Akatani sees the gnarly cut beneath the underground hero's right eye, he can't withhold a gasp. It's still healing, but it's sure to leave a permanent deep scar. For someone whose quirk relies on sight to function, the time of usage will no doubt diminish. It's not as bad as it looks, kid. Aizawa tries assuring the boy, but his nurse wears an expression that says otherwise. Now is a critical time to be healing. It's best if you don't use her quirk for a few weeks, at the very least. Recovery Girl gives her doctor's orders while applying a fresh clean set of bandages to hide the gash. But Aizawa isn't persuaded. The boy can only eat if he tries explaining Akatani's situation in defense of the situation. But Akatani is quick to cut him off. It's okay. The outburst draws everybody's attention, making Akatani recoil and shrink in on himself. Knowing Eraserhead's health is on the line though, he can't allow himself to back down. I am not hungry, so he lies. Are you sure? You shouldn't go weeks without eating. Aizawa's bandages crease with concern, and despite Recovery Girl's care for her patient, she too shares that same sentiment. Akatani stands up, nodding a little more forcefully than necessary, attempting to come across as confident. I've done it before. He turns to hide his face from them, forgetting that Naomasa is on the other side when he says the rest. I would try not to eat for as long as I could. Akatani's eyes widen when he sees the detective staring at him in bewilderment. Whatever Naomasa saw, Akatani ducks his head down to cover up. The boy slides his hands into his pockets, not wanting to fidget with them or ball them into fists. He feels in his pants the familiar leather mask of his ghoul persona. The thought of hunting on a rainy night is so alluring that he salivates a little. So long as you continue to keep that restraint, then there's nothing to worry about. Naomasa's voice draws his gaze back up. The detective is wearing a stern expression, but his eyes appear so trusting that it hurts to look into them for too long. Akatani averts his gaze. He's been given a chance he doesn't deserve. They're willing to trust him, to rehabilitate him, and he's about to throw that all away. To be fair, they'd only been fooling themselves. They were on borrowed time before Aizawa's accident. Who they had been kidding, Akatani doesn't know. All he does know is that their way didn't work. He'd tried. He really did. But what he's done and what he's about to do is his fundamental nature. The ghoul vows right then and there to find the one responsible for harming Aizawa, and to satisfy his hunger that way. You're going to be fine, right? Aizawa asks from behind him. Akatani turns around to face the hero, beaming the brightest smile he can muster, teeth and all. Yeah, he enthusiastically lies again. The clatter of tin against glass follows a canned coffee down into the disposable at the bottom of the vending machine. Akatani reaches in and takes the beverage, popping the lid open with a flick of his thumb. He was surprised that he didn't find Shinso loitering by the machine. Then again, he was very much relieved as well. He didn't come to the Quirk support group meeting place for idle chit-chat this time. Akatani, a blonde blur, rams into the boy all too suddenly. He nearly drops his drink, startled from his very brief thoughts. When he sees that it's the girl he called to meet him, he relaxes a little. "Hey Himiko." His eyes shift from her to another presence. A guy with patches of gnarled and wrinkled skin covering much of his face and neck looks about the place with disinterest. Who's your friend?" Akatani feels the need to ask. The obvious burn victim turns his gaze to meet Akatani's, eyes drooping in boredom as he introduces himself. "Dab." Akatani can't help but raise a brow at the name. Dabai just raises a brow right back. "You texted me saying you wanted me to introduce you to more of my friends." Himiko finally detaches herself from Akatani to present Dabai with a mild flourish. "So I thought I'd just bring one along." Akatani's eyes widen momentarily, remembering that he did indeed do that. He steps forward to introduce himself in return, bowing at the waist to be respectful. "Sorry for being rude. I'm Akatani Mikumo." Dabai doesn't seem fazed in the slightest. He's back to inspecting his surroundings, searching for something amongst the nothing. "So, Quirk counseling." His drawl is as impassive as he looks. He doesn't seem impressed by Akatani nor the location. Not exactly." The boy chuckles awkwardly as he returns to standing up straight, trying to think of a way to break the ice. He winds up scratching the back of his head, feeling his hair course through his fingers. Akatani perks up, finding something to say. "What brand hair dye did you use?" He nods his head in indication to Dabai's black pointed hair. Dabai falters, taken aback by the question. His shock quickly turns into something else, eyes narrowing. At least Akatani has his attention now. "How did you?" Akatani points to his own hair, takes one to know one, which earns a shock from Himiko next. The blonde bounces back over to the boy, leaning into his personal space. "You dye your hair?" Her yellow eyes glint in the light as she asks, "What color is it normally?" Akatani hesitates, unsure of whether or not he should answer. Then he remembers that this is Himiko. Even with Dabai listening in, he sighs and relents. "Green, but his cheeks are bright red." I can picture that." Himiko plays with the boy's curly hair by twirling it around her fingers. She imagines the color matching the blood that's rushing to his face and how he'd be lit up like a Christmas tree, giggling to herself. When Himiko switches her sights to Dabai, she's expecting him to share his natural hair color as well. The boy covered in burned sighs. "All the stress you give me made my hair turn white, so I had no choice but to dye it." But Akatani is relieved that he's capable of dry humor at the very least. Akatani laughs, agreeing wholeheartedly with Dabai. "Do you think I could be her next victim?" he asks in between guffaws. Himiko looks between the two boys before pouting. "You two sure are getting along rather quickly," and crosses her arms under her bust. "Yeah, well." Dabai turns his body away from them as though he's ready to leave. "I'm not really the social butterfly. If it's a friend that you were wanting." Akatani suddenly remembers the reason that he called Himiko here and had asked her to introduce him to her friends. "Oh, no. He winces when he realizes that came out wrong. "I mean yes, but..." Dabai lingers in between Akatani and the exit, forcing Akatani to get to the point. "I'm looking for..." The boy just isn't sure how to word it. "You wouldn't happen to be a part of a league, would you?" Dabai looks more confused than he did previously. "A league?" Responding quizzically, Akatani shakes his head. "Never mind." Before turning back to Himiko, "I just thought because of Yuta and his connection to the Yakuza that maybe you'd know where I could find." He realizes that he should have been more direct with her a little too late. Sighing to himself, he tries to explain. "There's some bad people I'm looking for in." He trails off when he sees the expression of hurt in Himiko's face. He realizes how much smaller she is than him when he hears her soft whimper, "You associate me with bad." "No," Akatani blurts out in an initial panic. He fumbles over himself as much as his words, not knowing whether he should say something or hug her. Dabai makes a strange noise from behind him before he gets the chance to apologize. When Akatani turns to see what the weird sound was about, he sees Dabai's non-scarred skin is rather pale, and that the burned boy's blue eyes are fixated on a newcomer. Shoto Todoroki approaches them from the opposite direction. "Mikumo." Todoroki nods in greeting to the boy that he recognizes before glancing between Himiko and Dabai. "Who are your friends?" Todoroki. Akatani feels sweat beating down his forehead as he's surrounded by the bunch of familiar faces. The only way this situation could possibly get worse is if Shinso suddenly materialized out of thin air to join them. He swallows, trying to get the right words to come out of his throat, but nothing coming up. His head swivels back to Himiko first. The blonde has hidden her hurt, faking a smile as she waves to Todoroki. "Himiko Toga." Her introduction is briefer than usual, but Akatani is admittedly relieved that's the case. Are you Akatani's friend? Yes. Todoroki doesn't sound very sure of that answer, but Akatani passes it off as part of the tension in the awkward situation. After all, Dabai isn't paying Todoroki any mind. He's been frozen in place, pale flesh tone making Akatani believe he really could have succumbed to frostbite. Todoroki returns his attention to Akatani, mutually ignoring the other boy. I actually came to offer you a gift, Mikumo. Akatani raises both of his eyebrows at that surprise. A gift. When Todoroki hands him the present, he isn't expecting 2 pink slips. For you and Eri. Todoroki's elaboration doesn't do much to actually explain anything until Akatani reads what's written on the paper in his hand. Tickets to UAS Sports Festival? The boy can't help but feel some elation. He'd always seen the event aired on television, but never attended it in person before. However, his excitement is short-lived. He pauses when he realizes, wait, Eri, also confusing Todoroki. Oh, Shinso didn't tell you. Akatani's grip on the tickets tightens. He's not sure how many more surprises he can take right now. Tell me what? Todoroki's heterochromic eyes squint as he tries to make sense of the situation. Akatani glances at Himiko, not all that shocked to see her staring right back. She's the only one that knows the truth, but she knows better than to call him out if he lies. Despite what he said, he doesn't associate her with bad. He hopes that the trust they share will let her know that. Yuri's father took her to America. She tilts her head but says nothing. Visitation rights and all that. Your father. Todoroki's mood significantly darkens. Akatani swivels his head from Himiko back to him. He sees the dual-quirked boy's fists are clenched at his sides. Dabai, as distant as he was, picks up on the change in attitude as well. Remembering Todoroki's past with his own father, Akatani's eyes can't help but be drawn between the boy's scar and Dabai's burns. She's safe. She's perfectly fine. He tries to sound assuring before allowing himself to succumb to his sorrow. I just miss her is all. You know, noticing the change in atmosphere, as well as everyone's demeanor, Todoroki also calms down. Yes, he has a sibling amongst his brothers and sister that he misses too. Even Dabai ducks his head in the back, relating in some way or another. Sensing somber moods, Himiko tries to salvage the situation by jumping in the middle. Can I have the extra ticket instead? Her bright and bubbly act pulls everyone out from their sulking states successfully. Please, I really want to go. Oh, sure. Akatani hopes that saying yes might help make up for upsetting her earlier. It must to some extent, since Himiko stands on her tippy toes to plant a kiss on his cheek. Yeah, it's a date. She cheers while snatching the ticket that she's claimed for herself. Dabai rolls his eyes while watching the entire exchange. Having had enough, he turns his back to them. I'm leaving, and announces his exit. Himiko teasingly sticks her tongue out at him, even though he can't see it. Oh, don't be such a sour seagull. And doesn't seem all that bothered that she made him uncomfortable. Returning to his stoic self, Todoroki turns towards Akatani to say, You have strange friends, Mikumo. Wanting to retort, Akatani opens his mouth. When he realizes that he can't, his shoulders sag and he sulks while admitting, I know. There are so many smells wafting through the air. Concession stands selling hot dogs and other meats alongside vendors that mix caramel or churn cotton candy. It's enough to make any person salivate. Through all those different promising tastes, however, the scent that the ghoul amongst the crowd finds most alluring is that of a mouse scurrying about. The rodent feasts on all the unfinished snacks people leave behind, nibbling on the litter. The ghoul runs his tongue along his lips, adopting that idea. Where nobody will bother looking, Akatani takes a detour into an alley. The overstuffed trash cans and overloaded dumpster had drawn the mouse away from the crowded festival. Out of sight and in the dark during the day, Akatani stops for a quick bite. Literally, he sinks his teeth into the mouse, fangs digging into flesh so easily. The blood doesn't just seep from the screeching rat, it gushes out in a rush like a bursted balloon, as though it too couldn't wait to get in the ghoul's mouth. The taste is bitter, not sweet like a human. Akatani almost spits it out. Yet, it's better than nothing. He doesn't know if he could withstand the festival if he doesn't take this precaution. When a little girl had fallen and scraped her knee, he could barely hold himself back. A small snack to hold him over to his next meal suddenly seemed like a good idea to him. If a mouse is the best he could find on such short notice, then it'll have to do. Once he's finished, he wipes the blood smeared across his mouth with his sleeve. It'd be easier to explain a red stain there instead of on his face if anybody asks. Though he doubts anybody will if even Himiko doesn't once he meets up with her. The blonde latches onto that same arm, wrapping both of her own around it and squeezing. The seats Todoroki had gotten them are pretty good. They're just shy of the front row, but that's good considering the placement of the bleachers and not having to worry about heads getting in the way. Himiko snuggles against Akatani's side, pushing his arm up and over her shoulders to wrap around. When the boy looks down at her with surprise, she feigns innocence with a smile that doesn't flash her fangs. Akatani blushes and looks away, but doesn't retract his arm. He's aware of how much they must look like a couple being so close together. Part of him wonders if they actually are. Having no experience with girls, he's not sure what their relationship status currently. It's not like he can muster up the courage to ask her either. The two of them share moments where he thinks that she likes him just as much as he likes her, but he's too afraid to ruin their friendship. And considering Himiko's personality, he figures that's just the way she acts around everybody. He's grateful that the sports festival is beginning its first event, since that ought to take his mind off it. Classes are being called out onto the massive field where a wheel will decide how they'll compete. Akatani searches the crowd of hero hopefuls and other UA students, looking for Todoroki or Shinso. Instead, he spots someone from his childhood. Absent-mindedly, Akatani pulls Himiko a little closer to him, his hand gripping her shoulder a bit harder than it should. The small smile on his face is partially forced, but he can't help but admit to admiring his old friend. Of course Kaken would get into UA. The boy had been gifted with a quirk suited for heroics, and his tenacity makes him as equally perfect of a hero candidate. As a matter of fact, when the boy is called to the podium for having the highest score in UA's practical exam, he declares that he's going to win the festival with sincere determination. Himiko notices Akatani's internal crisis from beside him. She takes his free hand in hers, hoping to pull him back to reality. Feeling her soft touch, he does get drawn to the girl. His eyes gaze into hers, green staring into yellow. The compromised emotional state each of them share are locked away and hidden behind those lenses. For a moment, they allow one another to catch a glimpse of that vehemence. Akatani swallows, his mouth dry. Himiko's eyes are so similar to a feline's that they can sometimes seem predatory. They remind him of his own from time to time. He forces himself to look away, returning his attention to the sports festival. He's content enough with her soft hand in his rough one. So long as she holds him in place here, he doesn't have to feel like being out in public is a risk. Or so he hopes. When he hears Aizawa's voice through the stadium speakers, that helps to sober him up as well. He wasn't expecting Eraserhead to be a part of this year's commentary with present mic. He partially wonders if Eri is in the booth with them overlooking the show as well. He hopes so. He hopes she gets to enjoy the games and the performances from such a good view. Thinking of her and the underground hero makes him squeeze Himiko's hand. He has to stay grounded for all of their sakes. Losing control and letting himself loose here of all places wouldn't do any good. He sighs, slouching in his seat, knowing how long the sports festival can be. He may as well get comfortable, though the first tournament does go by rather quickly. That could have to do with the fact that it was a foot race through an obstacle course. The participants navigated through a terrain of massive robots and over a canyon before coming to a minefield. That's where Todoroki had a face-off with Kaken, each of them using their quirks to cross the grounds faster than the rest of the racers. It was quite the spectacle. The crowd cheered and awed over the close finish. Todoroki had taken first place and Kaken second, wowing even Akatani. He hadn't expected his childhood friend to be beaten. Kaken never lost as far as Akatani was concerned. He could hardly believe his eyes that he had to rub them and blink back a few tears. Maybe times had changed. Maybe Kaken isn't the same kid that he remembers. After all, even he had changed over the years they split apart. When an explosion goes off down in the arena below, Akatani takes it back. Kaken still has a short fuse to go along with his dynamite detonating quirk, though coming in first place, in the end, worked against Todoroki. For the second challenge, remaining players were given headbands with points based on their race placements. The less time it took to cross the finish line, the higher the number. When it's announced that to win the second round, participants must capture other people's headbands to earn the most points, Todoroki practically has a target over his head. Akatani winces, sympathizing with his friend. He doesn't envy being in that predicament, but does partially wish he could help somehow. The second round is a cavalry battle where players must partner with each other to make groups of 4. So at least Todoroki isn't alone. Akatani is relieved to see Shinso joining the team at the very least. Some pink-haired girl with a bunch of gadgets also willingly comes over to offer her services. Akatani had been worried that Todoroki would have trouble convincing people to work with him, but that doesn't seem to be the case. The game ought to go on to be an interesting one. All the teams rush Todoroki at once. Todoroki throws up an ice wall to shield he and his team long enough to fly away with a jetpack, shocking the audience. What doesn't surprise Akatani, however, is Kaken finding a way to pursue the dual-quirked boy even when airborne. Kaken uses his explosions to fly after Todoroki, creating an aerial battle. Akatani leans forward, engrossed by the competition he's witnessing. Shinso says something that gets Kaken to respond. Then, the Insomniac's quirk takes effect. Kaken freezes up and falls out of the sky like a plane that's run out of fuel. Akatani momentarily worries that his childhood friend is going to lose or get hurt, but relaxes when the blonde's team catches him. It was a close call, close enough that Kaken doesn't try it again. Unfortunately for Todoroki, his jetpack actually does run out of fuel. He and his team are forced to land. As soon as he does, all teams converge on him all over again. He tries freezing them all in place, but that only delays them briefly. He's forced to rely on the teammate he had joined him at the last minute. The tall blue-haired boy with glasses who has engines in his calves reveals a trump card. Those leg thrusters rev to their maximum potential before launching the team like a rocket. They cross the field to the opposite side in a matter of seconds, buying them some more time. It seems Todoroki's strategy is stalling for as long as he can, though Akatani isn't sure for how much longer his friend will be able to keep that up. There are just too many opponents surrounding him with too long of a countdown to the end, especially since Kaken is one of those competitors, blasting towards him at max speed. The blonde reaches for the headband, about to snatch it away. And then, Todoroki's left side ignites with flames. Kaken instinctively retracts his hand, avoiding the fire, and then redirects himself with his explosions to prevent crashing into the ground. Todoroki's flames recede just as quickly as they had appeared. The brief exchange has both of them shaken and Akatani even more invested in their match. He's not sure who to root for or what to expect from either of them anymore. Just at the height of the competition, the timer hits 0 and the buzzer sounds, indicating that the round is over. Akatani lets out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. A much-needed intermission begins, allowing Akatani to excuse himself. He goes to the bathroom to splash some water on his face, to regain control of his senses, to do something to keep himself under control. It's becoming increasingly difficult to regulate his instincts. So when he catches a whiff of blood, he nearly loses himself. His nostrils flare and he staggers back from the rush of adrenaline that hits him like a wave. Akatani's hand catches the doorframe, crushing the cement as he squeezes it like a stress ball. Akatani's vision blurs despite the enhancement that his Kakugan grants him. He covers his exposed eye with the hand that had been clutching the doorway. When he lifts his head, he sees the source of blood exposure. A familiar skeletally skinny blonde coughs into a napkin. It takes a moment for Akatani to remember. The man was a customer at Anteku. He must be sick. The boy swallows the saliva that's been accumulating in his mouth. The unhealthy blonde drops his napkin into the trash disposal before walking towards the exit. Akatani nearly trips over himself as he tries to get out of the way. The man is polite as he passes by. "Excuse me, young man." Unaware of the ghoul's desire to feed, Akatani wants to respond, to warn the man, but he's too afraid of what'll happen if he opens his mouth. He doubts such a sick person would be able to defend themselves if he loses control. A much younger blonde suddenly comes along to tend to the ill elder. The healthier human pauses when he spots Akatani, voice catching in his throat. "Are you all right?" He pays the boy no mind and returns his attention to the man who had been coughing up blood. Akatani internally wonders if they're related. Perhaps the older blonde is the younger one's father or grandfather, he figures. The frail father figure places a comforting hand on the fellow blonde's much sturdier shoulder. "I'm fine, young Tagada." But Tagada doesn't seem all that convinced. He reluctantly turns around to head back up to the bleachers, if you say so. Akatani backs into the bathroom, watching them leave. He's extremely aware of his heartbeat, and all the blood pumping through his veins to make it pound so hard. That was too close of a call, more than he knows. He nearly vomits from the amount of anxiety, but only coughs up some spittle. He's disgusted with himself, disgusted that he nearly devoured such a defenseless man, disgusted that he dug into the trash disposal to recover the blood-stained napkin. A quiet police precinct is a bad omen. The lack of commotion is reminiscent of the calm before a monstrous storm. It feels like the start of a new saga. Naomasa closes the door to his office, hoping that it'll be enough for him to bunker down when the predicted chaos hits. The detective's tan overcoat and hat hang from a wooden stand, matching the man's demeanor once he plops into his seat. Even though Tamakawa ordered him a new chair to replace the damaged one, he can't get quite as comfortable as he'd like. A gooseneck lamp gives him a dim light to read over reports that still need filing. But he first has to resolve the case that came before those. He uses the landline phone provided by the precinct, dialing Eraserhead's number. After a few rings, the underground hero picks up. Naomasa forces back a sigh of relief, expecting to have gotten Aizawa's answering machine instead. "I don't have time for courtesy calls." Aizawa's voice grumbles from the other end of the line. He sounds tired, per usual, like he had just been woken up by the phone ringing. Knowing the underground hero, that's likely the case. Naomasa closes his eyes, already frustrated with the man before they can even begin their conversation. Aizawa has a knack for giving him a headache. That's not exactly what I'd like to call these checkups, but they're mandatory. The detective chooses his words carefully as he broaches the reason for reaching out. "You're calling about the kid," Aizawa says matter-of-factly. There's an audible sigh through the phone before the underground hero grunts out, "I haven't heard from him." Naomasa sits up in his seat, rectangular eyes opening wide. "You haven't?" His grip tightens on the phone. "Don't you find that the least bit concerning?" Memories of the Tokyo ghoul case when it first started slowly creep their way into his thoughts. The excessive amount of violence, the devouring. When Naomasa doesn't even hear the underground hero's breathing anymore, he presses the phone closer to his ear and asks again, "Aizawa." Aizawa takes longer than Naomasa would have liked to answer. "This unorthodox approach was my idea. I'll take responsibility if he steps out of line." And his tone sounds much too reserved for such a serious matter. Naomasa shakes his head, glad that the underground hero can't see it. It's evident that Aizawa developed some sort of emotional attachment to the boy. It's going to be difficult discussing the topic. The detective struggles to help the underground hero think logically as he too attempts to think straight. "He's not one of your students." He's a... Don't finish that sentence. Aizawa's harsh tone cuts the detective short. The line goes silent after that. Naomasa himself isn't sure what he was going to say about Akatani Mikumo, but he knows that it would have been regretted had he said it. Though grateful Eraserhead kept him from classifying a young boy as something more extreme, Naomasa still stays staid. He swallows before saying, "Just don't forget the things that he's done." Though unable to see Aizawa's expression, the detective is sure that the underground hero will keep that in mind. Even so, Eraserhead doesn't assure him verbally, "Worry about catching real killers." Like Stain, the mention of another unresolved case gets the detective riled up. Stain is. But Aizawa is ruthless. "In Hasu, you know where he's located and you aren't acting. A good number of heroes are assembling there to make up for our numbers, including Endeavor." Naomasa grits his teeth and caresses his forehead in an attempt to relieve some tension. "You've never pushed this hard about Stain before. Did something happen?" Ingenium. The underground hero's one-word response catches the detective by surprise. Stain's latest victim. Naomasa recalls the incident report and even has half a mind to dig it up. He instead settles on asking more directly, "A tragedy, but what about him?" He shouldn't have expected the relation to be to the underground hero himself. Of course Aizawa's answer would pertain to his kids. "He's the older brother of one of my students." Oh, Naomasa sinks back into his chair with a hefty sigh. "I think he's going to do something stupid. He accepted an internship in Hasu." Aizawa's tone suddenly has a hint of urgency that sets the detective's nerves on fire. Understanding what kind of intentions those actions imply, Naomasa is back to sitting up straight in no time. "And you're going to let him take it? It'd do more harm than good to put that kind of pressure on him. He'd likely just go after Stain anyways. At least this way I can keep tabs on him." Naomasa had almost forgotten how logical the underground hero can be sometimes. With how dramatic Aizawa had been between his emotions high and his conspiracy theories, he'd have never guessed there could be any validation behind his decisions. The detective slaps a hand against his face as he tries to resist moaning in pain. "So we've got two problematic kids and the hero killer. Whether the pain is mentally or physically, he couldn't say." Aizawa sounds as equally strained but almost assuring to some extent. "Let me deal with the problem child and you just make sure neither has the chance to run into Stain." Unfortunately, it's much too late to prevent such an encounter, and any assurement otherwise would be misplaced. Akatani's absence from Aizawa has sent him spiraling straight into the night. The ghoul's limbs spin with his twisting body. The appendages latch onto sides of buildings and pull him from ledge to ledge. The ghoul is present among gargoyles, stalking the night itself. And right there with him is another predator, the kind that hunts heroes. A self-proclaimed vigilante that utilizes a katana leaps rooftop to rooftop. He's just as starved for action as the ghoul is. He thirsts for the taste of blood on the tip of his tongue all the same. So when the two clash over the same prey that they had been stalking, it's to be expected. A low-level hero who had used his status to coerce a young woman into an alley where he could have his way with her. Both hunters deemed him worthy of their aggressive nature. He's now caught in the middle of their quarrel. The low-level hero cowers in the corner of a new alley, arms barely shielding his sight of the violent battle. Stain parries two strikes from the ghoul's limbs like venomous vipers he must fend off before moving with unnatural speed to avoid being impaled by a third. When he brings his blade down to go on the attack, it shatters under the pressure of a fourth limb. Stain stumbles before unsheathing a pair of daggers, ducking low under a high swipe of the ghoul's tentacles. He closes the distance between himself and his fellow predator, almost losing an eye but instead being cost an ear. His opponent is fast too, avoiding an upward slash, but not dodging the second blade that nicks his shoulder. The ghoul reels back with a reflexive flick of its tails, one slamming into the hero killer's chest. Stain is sent into a brick wall, rattling whatever parts of his ribcage that aren't broken. He hits the floor just as hard, but doesn't allow himself to lose consciousness. Whoever moves quicker than the other is who will win the match. What determines the turnout is whether Stain will be able to use his quirk before the ghoul can reach him or not. The hero killer runs his tongue along the bloodied end of the dagger in his hand as the ghoul pounces. Without an inch of coiling around the hero killer, the ghoul stops. The blood-curdling effect of Stain's quirk grabs hold of the frenzied creature, holding it in a place of suspended animation. The hold that the hero killer has over the ghoul is a form of paralyzation. Such incapacitation became the hero hunter's natural instinct in his way of fighting. The same way a Komodo dragon bites its prey and then waits. The patient are deadly. Stain snarls at the grotesque features of the ghoul's leather mask, deeming it unsightly as much as its quirk. You dare to intervene. He searches for a reason or a shred of conviction within the chasm that is the ghoul's eye. Finding nothing in the void, the hero killer rips the ghoul's mask off to see what kind of face hides beneath, only to be shocked by what lies underneath. A face much too young to witness or partake in bloodshed stares back. You're just a boy. The hero killer falters momentarily, but quickly recovers, shaking off the initial surprise. Explain yourself. His growl doesn't expose any sort of inner turmoil, nor does the blade that presses against Akatani's neck to usher a response. Whether it's due to the difficulty talking thanks to Stain's quirk or an act of rebellion, Akatani doesn't reply. The ghoul instead bares its fangs, the boy gritting his teeth together as he struggles to break free of the hero killer's quirk. For what reason? Foolish youth. Thrill-seeking. Stain doubts the interference of his hunt was anything noble. One look at the boy exposes his animalistic nature, an override of any proper sense or judgment. Through clenched teeth, the boy sees. Can't help it. His lips don't move, but his words formulate just enough for Stain's hearing to catch. Move on my own. The hero killer's eyes go from laser-focused narrowed slits to broad and baffled. He rarely misjudges people and their intentions, but the boy's reason touches him in a way he didn't expect. The few true pure-hearted heroes tell stories of how their bodies moved on their own to save lives. Stain begins wondering if the boy truly falls under that same category, fighting ferociously to save even a fake hero's life. Stain reconsiders that perhaps the boy is worth sparing. Little does he know that he completely misunderstood Akatani's angered answer. The boy's body hadn't moved to save the hero. It had moved to kill, to eat. The ghoul's starvation had reached a point so extreme that he could no longer hold himself back. When Stain leaves Akatani frozen in place, the boy considers himself anything but heroic. As a matter of fact, he starts worrying that he may be more villainous than the hero killer. The walls shake just as violently as the boy's bellicose body, with each feral swipe at nothing. There's an even more barbaric yell. Each cry is desperate, mercilessly clawing at his throat to climb out and escape. The pastry he had taken from Deku in a futile attempt to pacify his intense hunger rises to the surface of his widespread mouth too. He staggers, nauseous. He knew this would happen, and yet he's still surprised by the violent backlash. Akatani clutches his stomach, the pit already emptied and his craving returned. His hands tremble as they climb up from his gut to his ribcage, clinging onto his upper sides. His fingers run along the thin slots that are between bones, those slits feeling more defined than ever. His brain feels like it's swelling beyond the capacity of his skull, to the point that his starvation is too obvious to ignore any longer. He's winded, ragged breaths coming faster than the cold sweat beating down his paling skin. Again, Akatani cries out in agony. His stomach lurches and gurgles. He raises his heavy eyelids halfway only for them to fall shut. The aching in his sides surges upward to meet the pain in his skull. There's something about hunger that robs the spirit as well as the body, until the ability to fight is completely stolen from him. The boy bends forward, puking out a mixture of the aforementioned half-digested pastry and bile. Saliva streams out as well, dripping from his quivering lips. His thinning body tremors too, shrinking in on itself. He locked himself in after the incident with Stain. Unable to resist his extreme urge to not only eat, but to hunt and kill, he had considered himself lucky to be stopped by the hero killer's quirk. That is until after the hunted hero fled the scene, slipping away during Akatani's brief conversation with Stain, prompting Stain to leave Akatani behind too. All alone in the alley and unable to move. All Akatani could think about was how starved he is. His hunger increased with every passing second that he returned to his home in order to be reclusive, where he wouldn't accidentally harm anyone that didn't deserve it. The hot dog vendor on Sakura Drive would have been an innocent victim. Devouring the group of teens spending their night ding-dong ditching the neighborhood would have made him a villain, not a vigilante. The ghoul claws at himself, wanting to be let out. Akatani's ribs are truly a cage, and the bones are the less than sturdy bars. He twitches and wraps his arms around himself even tighter. Pastries won't satisfy him, not even if Aizawa were here to erase his quirk. He's waited too long. It's past the point of no return. As though the mere thought of the underground hero is enough to summon him, Akatani's cell phone rings. The caller ID shows that it's Aizawa who is trying to reach him. The boy is unable to answer, the drool pooling out of his mouth making it impossible to form a sentence. So he lets it ring and ring. The insistent sound agitates him. It's like a bell calling him for dinner, but there's no meal on the table. Eventually, it ends, and the call goes to voicemail. Aizawa's voice filters through the phone as he leaves a message. Mikumo, you haven't been returning my calls. It's been a while since you last ate, and I've recovered well enough that you should. Aside from that, a familiar younger voice interrupts, raising in volume with an added rustling, indicating that it's getting closer. Akata Niai. Eri chirps like a bird singing a song. Eri really wants to see you. Aizawa continues as though the little girl hadn't just grabbed the phone from him. Akatani can hear the smile on the man's face though. There's a pause after that before Aizawa adds, I would like to see you again too, to make sure you're doing well. Akatani lets out a deep guttural growl as loud as his stomach's growling. The thought of Aizawa in front of him, a thin human, but a sack of meat nonetheless, the thought of flesh is enticing. Call me back soon. The underground hero ends the message he's leaving. Akatani fixates on the man's voice. He imagines Aizawa's throat. He imagines sinking his teeth into it. Eri would be with the underground hero too. She would run straight into Akatani's arms for a hug. It would be so easy to crush her. Like a boa constrictor or a python, he wouldn't even need to use his kagyun. She's small, but she'd make for a delicious appetizer. The ghoul salivates as he fantasizes digging into her muscle tissue. Then, he stops. Akatani freezes in place when he realizes what he just pictured. The horror dawns on him. He had just imagined feasting on Eri. He had wanted to not only harm her, but to eat her. He screams more violently than he ever has in his entire life. He hadn't roared at the top of his lungs like this ever since the night he devoured his own mother. Tears stream down his face as he pivots in hysterics. The room spins like his head as he stumbles around. Disgusted with himself, he throws his own body against the nearest wall. The impact leaves an indentation, destroying the sheetrock. He doesn't care. Akatani's kagyun sprouts from his back, tentacles whipping without rhyme or reason. The appendages are as frantic as he is. Fallen into a self-focused frenzy, he crashes into his table and shatters it. The tails swing so strongly that his body twists with them and he's sent spiraling into the kitchen. Akatani slams into a counter, shattering the ceramic. He wants to destroy himself, but all that he's capable of damaging is his home. Everything easily breaks under the sheer force of his kagyun. But his body doesn't even bruise when he rams it into a piece of furniture, so he keeps screaming. At the top of his lungs, he yells out all of his pent-up frustration. The thought doesn't cross his mind that his neighbors may call the police or a hero may come out of concern of the cry for help. He's too engrossed in his own self-loathing to do much thinking anymore. His mind races, overwhelmed by a series of screeching. He can't release the same type of terrible noise, but he comes close. The hunger is one thing, but the desire to harm the ones he loves is too much for him to bear. He'd already killed his past life as Izuku Midoriya. He doesn't want to lose another. Akatani sinks slowly, falling to his knees. His shoulders shake and his body crumbles as it's racked with extreme surges of sobs. Then, something soft grabs onto those same shoulders. The feeling is light. It doesn't add to the heavy weight leaning on them. Whatever it is, it's calming. A tender touch. Akatani looks up, trying to see through the tears obscuring his vision. What he sees is a blur, but he recognizes the shape. The blonde buns, the feminine form. Akatani's blackened eyes widen, the corners cracking so much that the exposed red veins start to seep blood. At the epicenter of the dark void, each red iris shrinks as they focus on the subject in front of them. Himiko Toga, her pale flesh ripe for the taking. All he has to do is reach out and take it. His fangs are sharper than hers. He can kill. He can eat. He can kill. He can fight it. He can resist the urge. Barely. Akatani's eyelids slam shut, closing as tight as possible. He seals off the sight of a perfect meal's beauty. It's a desperate attempt to make the blonde not appear as appetizing. But he can still smell her. Her scent is enticing. His nostrils flare as he inhales. Akatani shakes his head as hard as he can, hoping it flies off. It's just as difficult to formulate a coherent sentence as it is to hold back his instinct. But he has to warn her. Shouldn't be here. He grinds his gritted teeth as drool pulls out from the corners of his mouth. He barely hears Himiko trying to respond. She's probably been saying stuff to him all this time, but his other senses had overwhelmed him to the point of tuning her out until now. He tries to focus on the sound of her voice, not the organs that make it possible for her to speak, not her slender throat, just her words. He hears her words. It's okay. He stops listening. It's not okay. She doesn't know. He can't expect her to understand. He shouldn't blame her. But she doesn't comprehend the danger she's in. Akatani pushes her away. Or, that's what he wants to do. He just wants to distance himself from her so that she's safe from harm. He means to do so gently. Instead, he shoves her. He lashes out with a shout and tosses her across the room. Hearing her cry out in surprise, opening his eyes to see what he's done. His hands tremble in front of him, the same hands that threw her. He tucks them into his armpits, bending over so that he can't see her pained expression. He's afraid that he'll hurt her. He already has. Akatani whines as he tries not to hurt her again. He turns his head away, trying to focus on something else. If he doesn't see her, he might not want to hunt her. That's what he hopes for anyways. His eyes land on the door. Its hinges are broken and it's wide open. Himiko must have kicked it in. She must have come by to check on him, heard his screaming, and broke in to make sure he's safe. Akatani lowers his head, staring at the ground. He'd made the mistake of thinking about the blonde again. Akatani. Himiko tries getting his attention. The boy covers his ears, attempting to block her out. Akatani. Himiko tries again, shouting this time. She grabs his wrists and pries his hands away from his ears so that he can hear her. Akatani, look at me, she pleads. Akatani doesn't want to. He knows what'll happen if he does. He won't be able to contain himself. He'll attack her, just knows he will. But that part of him wants to. It wants to attack. It wants to rip and tear past her skin. It wants to chow down on her intestines. The ghoul wants to look at its next meal. Akatani raises his head, no longer in control of his own body. He's shocked by what he sees. She's presenting herself to him. She's actually offering her neck to him. The left side of her cardigan is slightly pulled down, exposing her shoulder where a black bra strap is. She's blushing, but not like she usually does. This time, she's bashful. She's shy. It makes Akatani blush too. For more reasons than one, he's drawn to her. Bite me. Her voice is as tiny as her size, but it's also genuinely inviting. Akatani gawps at her, not believing what he's hearing or seeing. When her yellow eyes meet his dark voids, however, he feels a familiar sense of kinship that has him believing. He leans forward, part of him still hesitant and trying to resist out of fear that he'll go too far. But another part of him is unable to help himself. He wants to tackle her and go straight for the jugular, but he can't bring himself to do that to her. He has to hold himself back. He has to. Himiko is tired of waiting. She lurches at him first, striking suddenly. Her fangs sink into the spot between his own neck and shoulder, breaking skin and biting flesh. Akatani gasps in shock and partly pleasure. It doesn't hurt as much as he would have expected, but it does catch him by surprise. It also does something to him instinctively. He's not just driven by an animalistic urge to feast or fight, but to bite back and assert his dominance. Akatani bites Himiko hard. She lets out a muffled moan, not releasing her own bite's grip. They both relish in the intimacy of the moment, sucking on each other's blood, the flavors that flow into their mouths. Akatani's RC cells and Himiko's sweet nectar. The ghoul had never tasted such blood before. It's like honey. Himiko is in a similar state of bliss. Akatani's blood is much better than any of the other people's blood that she drank. The two wrap their arms around one another, pulling their bodies closer. Neither wants to let the other loose, locking their jaws tight. Himiko's nails scrape Akatani like claws dragging across his skin. He too runs his fingers along the small of her back, like talons digging into flesh. Their moans increase in volume as they each share each other's blood. Bodies intertwined. Akatani's kagun wraps around them both like a protective shell. Instead of tightening its hold, however, gently embraces the two. For once, Akatani doesn't feel so bad, allowing lust to overcome him. There's a ringing in his ears without the use of an alarm clock. That same piercing rumbling shakes up his stomach next. And so he wakes up as if there is an emergency, as if sleeping had suddenly become a dangerous thing. Considering his nocturnal nature and the lack of bed rest prior to now, he feels that may very well be true. His heart matches the throbbing rhythm with rapid thumps as the buzzing segues from his ears to his brain. Akatani feels as though he's hungover, an after effect of some sort of drunken state that leaves him woozy. When he shifts in the bed to sit up, his shoulder screams at him too. Wincing at the sharp sting, Akatani glances at the sore spot to see a bite mark. Suddenly, he's no longer delirious. The ambience fades and his vision focuses as he sobers up. He's awake and he's able to see that he didn't sleep alone. In the bed next to him is a familiar blonde, her usual buns undone and her hair a mess. The blood in his system goes to his face, making it a bright red hue. Her body is covered by the blankets and sheets, but his imagination gets the better of him, turning away and smacking his cheeks to calm down. Akatani shakes his head to clear away those impure thoughts. He doesn't recall doing anything of sexual nature with her. Well, not in the ordinary sense at least. His eyes are drawn back to the bite mark on his shoulder. It still hasn't healed for some reason. Even if Himiko had bitten deep enough for it to scar, that shouldn't be. His quirk has been on the fritz for a while now. It may be from the lack of nourishment, he figures. However, even if that's the case, it's a tad bit concerning. The rustling of sheets behind him has Akatani snapping out of his thoughts and turning back around. Himiko stirs from her sleep, blinking back any remaining sleepiness. No breakfast, she asks in a drowsy voice. As flustered as he should be, Akatani keeps his mind honed on the most important factor of the blonde's presence. That was dangerous, what you did. He has to remind himself of the night before and the state he was in when she had found him. He was at his tipping point, and being as close as she was to him in such a starved state of mind, things could have gone horribly wrong as opposed to how things actually turned out. Himiko, however, doesn't quite comprehend the meaning of what he's saying. Misinterpreting his statement, she blushes a bit while averting her gaze. We didn't do anything that needed a condom. That's not what I meant. Akatani's eyes go wide as he flails his hands in a wild gesture to make her stop. While he may have been able to keep his embarrassment at bay before, that was enough to send him over the edge. His face heats up more than the girl's. But you should still take responsibility, Himiko carries on anyways. Whether she didn't hear the boy or just enjoys teasing him is unclear. Himiko, but Akatani eventually has enough. The blonde stops, hearing the severity in the tone of his shout. His blush fading, Akatani schools his expression and returns his gaze to hers. I could have gone too far. What if I didn't stop at drinking your blood? What if I? His voice trails off, getting caught somewhere in his throat. Now comprehending what he meant, Himiko takes Akatani's hands in hers in an attempt to console him. Hey, I'm still here, see? She gives them a soft squeeze to show him that she's alive and well. Sighing, he nods. Thank you for being here. He can't leave it at that though, but I still think it was too dangerous. He looks deep into her eyes. He has to let her know that she can't do anything like she did last night ever again when he gets like that. Himiko hums, staring back at him. After a moment, she breaks the contact to glance at her shoulder. There's a specifically shaped mark there that matches the one on Akatani's shoulder. Well, you did bite pretty deep. You leave one heck of a hickey, Akatani. She returns to teasing him in an attempt to lighten the mood. It works, sort of. Akatani pulls away, embarrassed and flustered. I gotta call somebody back. He uses his phone as an excuse while unplugging it from its charging cord. Seeing Himiko brows raised inquisitively, he elaborates, it was about Eri. The blonde instantly beams at that. Oh, let me talk to her too. Let me say hi. She's throwing the sheets that cover her off, revealing a white t-shirt with kanji that reads pajamas. Recognizing the shirt as one of his own, Akatani swivels his body to face the opposite direction. He hastily stammers, sure, before calling Aizawa back. After a few rings, the underground hero picks up. Surprisingly, his voice isn't that groggy, problem child. You're lucky I'm up this early. Glancing around for a clock, Akatani winces slightly. Sorry, I just thought I'd return your call. I didn't really bother checking the time. He bashfully rubs the nape of his neck despite Aizawa not being able to see him. It's fine. There's nothing to apologize for. Aizawa is quick to allay the boy's worries though. Well, only momentarily. He's also quick to add, other than not calling before now. Where have you been? Oh, yeah, I've been. Akatani struggles for an answer as he tries to come up with a valid excuse or reason to his lack of contact. It's not like he can admit to having a breakdown to a licensed hero who reports to a detective that wants to lock him away. With the lack of an answer, Aizawa makes a guess. I've made a full recovery now if that's the reason why you've been avoiding me. I haven't been avoiding you. Akatani panics at the suggestion. Even if it is a little true, whatever you say. Aizawa huffs, hearing how much anxiety is in the boy's tone. The underground hero lets it go for the time being. My point is, you should be able to eat now without putting a strain on me. He instead gets back to the original purpose of their meetings. Akatani hesitates, searching for a response. Thank you. But he's not so sure he's able to face the man after what he's done or if the eating regime that they developed will even work anymore. You can't tell me you aren't hungry still. Aizawa catches the hesitation in Akatani's tone immediately. Worried about his problem child, he asks, you haven't been doing anything to hold yourself over, have you? No, Akatani shouts a little too forcibly. He grimaces at how hasty he was with his response before toning it down. No. His eyes are drawn to Himiko, who's been listening in on their conversation the whole time with mild intrigue. My, friend. The blonde frowns. My girlfriend. He tilts his head hopefully. Her frown diminishes and she nods. Hi. She cranes her neck forward to be heard through the phone. I wasn't aware that you weren't alone. Aizawa somehow manages to sound both amused and annoyed. She helps. Her quirk. It can. Akatani slaps a palm against his face when he realizes how terrible he is at communicating between his newly claimed girlfriend and technical probation officer. I don't need to hear the details. Aizawa cuts the boy short. Akatani holds back a sigh of relief, realizing the underground hero is probably just as at ease to drop the subject. He then asks, was she the one behind the blood bank idea? Remembering the time he and her broke into a blood bank, all Akatani can reply with is, oh. He doesn't want to get Himiko into trouble, but answers honestly anyways, yeah, that was her. I had a hunch, Aizawa says with a small smile on his face. Akatani can practically hear the expression on the man's face as he continues. It's better than the alternative, but don't do anything like that again. Yes, sir. Akatani allows himself to have a small smile too. So, are you absolutely certain that you don't want to come over for breakfast? The smile slips when Aizawa asks about eating again, especially when he adds, Eri would love to see you. Akatani's grip on the phone nearly crushes it when he remembers the extent of his craving and what he had fantasized doing. There's no way in hell that he could put her in that type of danger. Could you just put Eri on the phone instead? He tries to keep his emotions in check, but his voice comes out strained. Aizawa must notice by the way he pauses, but he's considerate enough to let it slide. Sure, kid. Akatani holds the phone away from his ear when he hears the sound of rustling and Aizawa calling out, Eri. It's for you, your brother, Akatani, followed by an even sharper shout from the little girl herself. Eri, hey. Akatani smiles again upon hearing her voice. He holds the phone closer to his ear now that she's talking. Dad said I'd see you soon. The sound of Aizawa choking on his saliva makes Akatani laugh. He wonders how long it's been since Eri started calling Aizawa that. She carries on cheerfully, oblivious to the man's coughing fit in the background. But it's been too long. I know. I want to see you too. He turns when he feels a tap on his shoulder. Seeing his girlfriend standing behind him, he remembers that he isn't alone. So does Himiko. He gives her an apologetic look before holding out the phone for her. Hi, Eri. Himiko flashes her teeth as she grins and speaks into the phone. Big sis, can she come too? Eri cheers loud enough for both of them to hear without it being on speaker. Akatani shouldn't be as taken back as he is, but it truthfully hadn't dawned on him that the two girls would be missing one another's company too. Well, he scratches the top of his head as his brain tries to process the request and the current situation. Of course I can, silly. Himiko replies just as cheerfully as Eri, as though any other option wasn't even to be considered. This only further eggs Eri on, leading her to ask, when, Akatani, when? When her older brother doesn't respond immediately or as excitedly as the two girls, Eri's tone becomes slightly discouraged and asks again, Akatani. Though Eri is unable to see the boy's expression, Himiko can, and what she sees is concerning to say the least. The blonde worriedly asks too, Akatani, reaching out a hand to touch him. Unexpectedly, he stands up straight, making her flinch back. He keeps his expression the same but talks in a relatively even voice. It's probably gonna be a while, Eri. Eri tries to keep the whining to a minimum, but her disappointment is evident. Whatever face Akatani had been making falters. The cracks in his mask expose sorrow. A trace of remorse and a wrinkle of regret trail down each of his cheeks like tears. But I want you to remember I'll always love you. You're my little sister. Even if I'm not there, I'll be keeping you safe. His voice cracks just the same as he tries not to expose his feelings any more than he already is. Eri's excitement reignites, mistaking his words for a different meaning. You're gonna be a hero. Not wanting to break her heart with an honest answer, but not wanting to lie, he refrains from responding. Instead, he says, I've gotta go, Eri. Oh, okay. Eri's mood plummets all over again on the wild roller coaster of emotion that she's riding. Wanting to save her from any more letdowns, Akatani decides it's best to just end their call. Goodbye. It comes out as a whisper, but Eri hears it. She starts to bid farewell back. Bye. But Akatani hangs up before she can. Watching the entire exchange and the boy's stricken expressions, Himiko reaches out with a tender hand. This time, he doesn't spook her by making any sudden movements. He stays as stiff as a stone statue. Akatani, what was that about? Her face scrunches up with concern as she tries to study him more closely. When Akatani's eyes meet hers, she thinks that she understands. I'm not going to get my hunger under control, and I won't put her in that kind of danger. I'd never be able to forgive myself. He's still wary of his own quirk and doesn't want to put Eri at risk. You need to stop worrying about hurting us. Himiko starts to assure him otherwise, but he has none of it this time. You know what I'm capable of. He knocks her arm away and pulls back. Before he can go on a rant about his quirk and the dangers of its drawbacks, he realizes that the blonde is hanging her head. Sorry, I didn't mean. He tries apologizing, but Himiko raises her head and fires back. You're forgetting that it's because of who you are and what you can do that I like you. He's shocked by her words and the passionate way that she says them. Remember, you saved me. You saved Eri. Like it or not, you're basically a hero. But he's still not hearing what her or anyone else has to say. He shakes his head, thinking bitterly that they'll just never understand. A hero? Huh. He scoffs but feigns a smile for Himiko anyways. Thanks for not giving up on me. The blonde frowns, gaze lowering. It falls and lands on his shoulder, where she left her mark on him. Akatani notices where she's staring and looks at hers. Each of them blush, but she doesn't pass up the moment. She bumps her shoulder against his, leaning into him. You're stuck with me now. Akatani locks up, not sure how to react. but after a moment, his body relaxes. He closes his eyes and sighs, conflicted with wanting to be happy with her but also wanting to keep her safe. He tries moving forward with his newfound plan. Himiko, if I'm a hero, then you remember what I wanted to meet Dabai for, right? His eyes reopen to look at her seriously. Himiko looks up, staring back questionably. That League of Villains thing. Akatani nods, stealing his resolve. I want to find him. They're a danger to Eri. And like I told her, even if I can't be there for her, I'll still continue to keep her safe. He decides right then and there what he's going to be from now on. The ghoul is a monster that had been villainized, but he can at least aim that beast towards those who deserve it, against Aizawa's better judgment. Akatani is going to leave behind his life at Antiku and commit to being a vigilante. Seeing the determination in his eyes, Himiko can't help but gush in awe. Such a cool big brother. Her face starts to heat up and she grins before grabbing onto his arm to steer him. Guess I gotta step up and do my part as her big sister. She begins pulling him towards the door so that they can start their new life together. Come on, Akatani. Let's catch a train to Hasu and find those villains, before either of them can back out and regret the decision too early. Blue hues blend with the black of the night. Each blinding array of building lights whizzes by outside the window of the train. The passenger car rocks back and forth on the tracks, with Himiko resting her head on his shoulder. It's almost soothing enough for Akatani to relax. Almost. He can't quite allow himself to enjoy the moment, not after essentially leaving his whole life behind. Again, he can't help but wonder what Eraserhead and the pro-hero's detective friend will think, or Yoshimura, or the friends that he made, Todoroki and Shinso, or Eri. Akatani's head lolls to the side, resting atop Himiko's. He at least allows himself to brood a bit. He thinks about where he's headed instead, even though that's no better or worse of a thought. He's headed straight for the Inferno, taking the train into Hasu with Himiko to find the League of Villains. Since the hero killer's activity there increased, it seems like the most likely place to find criminals lurking about. Birds of a feather flock together and all that. As a predator, it's easier to hunt and catch prey in packs rather than individually. The odds of snagging at least one from a group is higher than chasing a single target. Akatani just didn't expect to enter a literal inferno. The blue tint outside the train car's window shifts shades of color, from yellow to orange to red. Akatani sits up straight when other people in the car start to murmur over the light show, waking Himiko. Orange and red flares warp the city lights, growing brighter. It takes the spectators too long to realize why. A ball of flame is hurtling towards them, growing closer and burning harder. Akatani wraps his arms around Himiko to shield her, twisting their bodies away from where the ball of fire collides with the train car. Screams fill the metal container as glass shatters and shards spray across the tiny space. Those same yells are drowned out by the shrill sound of wind being sucked in and out of the giant hole that's been made. Akatani looks up to see what made such damage. A humanoid with green skin as pale as a dying leaf crouches down on all fours. Akatani notes that the being's brain is exposed, 4 eyes protruding from the organ. All they got on are gray trousers that are ripped at the calves. Akatani reaches into the back pocket of his own pants, feeling the leather of his mask. He's not sure whether what's attacking is human or something else, but his fight or flight response is telling him to fight. Akatani. Himiko squirms from under the boy's weight, but her indignant whines are more from a place of worry for him than uncomfortability. The other passengers of the damaged train car let loose a round of reactive noises again upon witnessing Akatani's slight transformation. The long, sleek appendages that sprout from the small of the boy's back whip side to side as he pulls on his mask. He leaves the zipper open, baring his teeth like fangs. The red of his kakyugen glows brighter than his kagyun, but he's just as bloodthirsty as ever. The humanoid shrieks at the ghoul, a visceral sound that makes everyone cover their ears but the ghoul himself, from under Akatani. Himiko tries grabbing onto an ankle to stop him from engaging it, but he's too fast. In one rapid and fluid movement, the ghoul tackles the humanoid creature through the hole that it created. They twist and flip in a fast freefall from the monorail to the grounds below, passing rooftops and plummeting straight for the earth. Registering the sudden change of events, Himiko is already standing up to hurry after them. Akatani. She calls after her boyfriend before leaping out of the cart willingly. Admittedly, she wasn't prepared to be woken from her sleep by a sudden villain attack. Now that she's gotten past her grogginess though, she's more than just grouchy. She's pissed. Nobody interrupts her beauty sleep and steals her boyfriend. The blonde unsheathes a knife that she keeps handy, landing in a roll on one of the higher rooftops. Her body aches from the rough tumble, but she catches herself and gets to her feet anyways. At the speed that the train was moving and how long it took for her to follow after Akatani, there's going to be some distance to travel before catching up with him. Though she's seen firsthand that he's more than capable of taking care of himself, she rushes to help him anyways. She has to close the distance as quickly as possible, because she cares too much about him to potentially lose him. As for Akatani, despite his blood and flesh withdrawal, he does handle himself well as Himiko had assumed. He binds the humanoid that he's fighting by its wrists and ankles with his predatory organ before attacking its exposed brain. His fingers claw at its open organ, ripping an eyeball loose. Gore spews across the alley that they had fallen into, filling the crater they made with a puddle of blood. The next impact in the ground comes from the humanoid alone, slammed into the cement by Akatani. It doesn't show signs of pain, just mere agitation as it tries to resist. The ghoul decides then and there that he doesn't have to hold back then. He latches onto the creature's throat, teeth sinking into its neck. Blood fills Akatani's mouth as the humanoid emits a gnarled gurgle from its damaged vocal cords. The bitten lashes out with a desperate swipe, backhanding Akatani across the chest. The humanoid has enough enhanced strength to knock the ghoul back. Akatani coughs as the wind gets blown from him, spit and blood flying out of his open mouth. The tentacles flailing after him stop his motion midair though, sparing him a second collision. One wraps around a nearby streetlight, using it as a pulley to launch the ghoul back at its opponent. A second swipe misses Akatani as he ducks under it, and with the humanoid's side exposed, he takes another chunk of its strange colored flesh. It blubbers from its lips as it tries to yell, bringing its other arm down. Akatani catches it by the wrist, applying pressure. Whether the humanoid is just too strong or the ghoul is lacking the nourishment to match that strength, the bones don't bend or break, much to Akatani's surprise. In that moment of shock, he's delivered another blow to the abdomen. The ghoul bends backwards, shoulder scraping the ground, and then contorts to land on his side. Injured, his tentacles coil protectively around him like a shield. But in between those tails, a red iris peers out with an intent to get even. When he seethes through his teeth, it sounds like a hiss. Then, the ghoul is rushing the humanoid. A red limb snakes upwards and pierces a shoulder while another sweeps out the being's legs. Then Akatani jumps with his arms and legs spread, a battle cry descending on an exposed brain. Akatani grabs onto the humanoid, fingers digging into its skin and legs locking around its waist. His teeth gnash together as they grind its brain matter, the squishy mush slopping in big bursts. Even with its neck torn out, the humanoid screeches at the top of its lungs. It staggers as it tries to remain alive, but ultimately gets devoured by its much more dominant enemy. The ghoul feasts on the unfamiliar flesh of his victim, indifferent to the bitter flavor of its green pigmentation. The fair share of meat reminds him of what it's like to actually eat. It's more satisfying than coffee or blood quenching his thirst. It's liberating, and Akatani can't get enough. He shovels handfuls of severed tendons into his gullet, swallowing them whole without bothering to chew. Saliva drips down from his chin as he inhales the scent of exposed liver. All that's capable of drawing the ghoul away from its first true meal in a long time is the promise of more. The screeching of a winged humanoid draws Akatani's eyes to the sky where he can see it flying overhead. This one is a pale yellow, its skin just as sickly as the previous creature Akatani put down. That doesn't stop him from launching himself at it to get a bite in though. In one pressurized push from the gathering of his tentacle appendages, he shoots through the air and crashes into it. The two monsters roll through the sky before crashing through a window and into a dining room. A few occupants scream as a vicious brawl breaks out. Akatani rips a chunk of flesh from the winged humanoid using his teeth before lifting it up into the ceiling, furiously flapping its wings in a futile effort to escape. The creature shrieks in desperation. The ghoul shows no mercy, bringing the fellow beast back down into the floor and then swinging it into a wall. The wild side-to-side ends with the two falling back out the window from which they came. Each brawler lands in the street, where more panicked bystanders flee from an intense wave of fire. Akatani reacts instinctively, not wanting to get caught up in the flames. His appendages pull him from the explosions and he lands on the other side of the road. It's from there that he can see the chaos that fills the night. More genetically engineered beings roam the city of Hasu, wreaking havoc. Heroes that Akatani recognizes from Endeavor's agency fight to hold them back as best as they can. Akatani ascends the nearest building to get a better view of the battle, unsure of how he should interfere. The fog in his mind is only now starting to clear enough for him to think. It begins to register that the creatures he and the heroes are fighting likely belong to the League of Villains he and Himiko are hunting. There's no other villain organizations at the moment, and he knows personally from his own encounter with Stain that the hero killer works alone, so there's no other option. He watches as the creatures below attack indiscriminately. Even if it weren't his personalized mission to track and kill the League of Villains, they're a danger to the people that he can't ignore. Akatani leaps from his perched position, landing on a bleached white humanoid's back. Latched onto the creature like a spider or a tick, he takes a bite out of its nape. It reacts violently, pivoting its body while roaring. Unlike the prior two that the ghoul had fought, this one has an extreme muscle density to match its newfound opponent. It grabs Akatani and tosses him off. The ghoul somersaults as he flies through the air before planting his Kagyun into the ground to stop himself. Ready to go on his own rampage, the ghoul uses the assault of the humanoids as an opportunity to have a feeding frenzy. Akatani momentarily turns his attention away from the white one to grab an energy booster, a small one of the creatures, tearing out its heart to chew on. Then, the ghoul returns to its original target. The two clash, the white humanoid absorbing the impact and using the force of the blow to augment its muscle. The asphalt of the road cracks and crumbles as their weight shifts against one another. Then, an extreme air force is released from all the pent-up intake. Akatani is blown back just enough for the white humanoid to follow up with a surprising quirk, a tongue-web combination that snares the ghoul. Akatani struggles against the net, growling. The creature cackles. The ghoul eyes the tongue wrapping him before realizing that it's organic matter and severs it with a bite. Blood splatters across the street as the tongue is ripped apart by the ghoul's manic snapping. The white humanoid retracts what remains, making an awful sound as it does. Akatani follows the tongue back to its owner, charging in again. A hard dropkick smashes the creature's exposed brain, pink mush spraying every which way in a mixture of blood. Its eyes ooze from the same placement, rolling out of their sockets. Grinning at his fallen prey, Akatani dives in for his reward. The brain matter squishes between his teeth and the muscle fibers ooze with blood. The satisfying meal leaves more to be desired, but the remaining humanoids are already being dealt with. The heroes have restrained the weaker ones. All that remains a duplicate of the white creature. It likely outclasses them, but not Endeavor himself. The number 2 ranked hero arrives in a glowing burst of fire, his hell flame completely cauterizing the remaining creature. It's destroyed beyond repair, flesh bubbling and blistering. Not even Akatani would want to eat the burnt to a crisp being. Endeavor stands over the defeated monster victoriously, one boot atop its corpse. He surveys the property damage and his sidekicks, eyes eventually landing on Akatani. When the two meet each other's gaze, an immediate understanding of what's about to happen reaches them. Endeavor doesn't bother evacuating the area or warning anyone. He just instantly launches an attack. Akatani's single exposed eye widens as he watches a tsunami of fire head his way. Though just a kid, and though Endeavor being quite a literal hothead, he supposes he can understand why the hero decided it was a good idea to attack him. For starters, he had been eating the corpse of one of the monsters terrorizing the city, not to mention the leather ghoulish visage mask that he's wearing. It doesn't exactly give him a good look, but still, he can't believe the guy didn't even hesitate. Akatani springs from his spot, coiling his limbs around a street post. The metal becomes superheated from the massive wave of fire that Endeavor unleashes, making him move from it to the next just as quickly. But Endeavor doesn't let up. He hurls a line of fireballs at the scurrying boy too. The ghoul hastily scrambles alongside the wall of an apartment complex to dodge the miniature explosions and takes another leap of faith to get away. But there's no fleeing from this fight. Endeavor is on him in an instant, flashing from one spot to the next to cut off his path. Akatani curses under his breath as the hero closes the distance. Unable to evade the incoming punch and becoming increasingly desperate, the ghoul does what any cornered animal would do. He bites. He catches the hero's burning fist in his mouth, sinking his teeth into the man's knuckles. Both Endeavor and Akatani feel an intense pain from the mixed contact. Endeavor reels from the bite with a shout, shocked to find his hand mangled. Akatani goes from seething through a mouthful of fire to sputtering and gagging as his lips hiss. Having his mouth burnt has the ghoul spitting out blood before he closes the zipper that exposes it. Having his knuckles chomped on makes Endeavor see red, his fist reclenching despite the pain it radiates in a burst of flame. Luckily for Akatani, and unluckily for the number 2 hero, it's right at this very moment that Himiko Toga finds her boyfriend. She strikes at Endeavor with her knife, catching him off guard just enough to cut his chest a bit. In that single fluid arriving motion, the blonde also grabs Akatani and roughly pulls him back. The two put some distance between themselves and the hero, landing behind a crushed car. Himiko, Akatani exclaims in as much surprise as Endeavor is to have been cut by a girl in a school uniform. Himiko whirls on Akatani, exasperated and out of breath from having to get here. What kind of hot mess did you get yourself into? The boy watches Endeavor charge up another attack, grabbing onto Himiko and pulling her from their cover to behind another car in order to avoid the incoming move. I don't really have an answer for that, he replies through gritted teeth as an explosion shakes the place that they once were. Endeavor isn't holding back. He's showing no mercy. He stomps towards them with heavy footfalls, boots burning into the pavement. You're not getting away. His tone is as serious as his hyper-focused expression. Himiko rebrandishes her knife, leaping up from behind the car and between her and the hero. Wanna bet she's just as angry as the number 2 hero and charges in headfirst. Endeavor meets her halfway, flames igniting from the palms of his hands as he reaches for her. As the burning limbs close in, he growls under his breath, only if it's your life that's at stake. If it hadn't been evident enough before, Akatani now realizes that the so-called hero isn't looking to capture them. His girlfriend's life is at stake. No, he leaps over the car in his way to help, but he's too far behind. He fears he isn't going to make it in time. Fortunately enough, somebody else does. A red blur swoops in at the last second, swapping places with Himiko. Akatani recognizes the scarf before he does the jagged blade that's blocking Endeavor's attack. The hero killer, Stain, has come to their rescue. Endeavor pivots back from the sudden strike and Stain sweeps his sword out to get one final lick in that manages to nick the hero's cheek. Akatani lands beside the hero killer, catching the tail end of his sentence. Been looking forward to hunting you most of all, Endeavor. Stain pauses when he notices the ghoul's arrival and diverts his attention just enough to acknowledge the presence. You again. There are many things Akatani wants to say and do in that moment, many of them conflicting with the other. However, the main thing that's on his mind is his girlfriend's safety. So what he chooses to do is bow, "Thank you for saving her." Stain grunts, sparing a quick glance at the blonde that he rescued. "Get her out of here. This fight is mine now." And then he returns his attention back to the flaming hero he's about to face in combat. You must be the hero killer. Endeavor is just as intently focused on his opponent. The fire encompassing his body increases in output in a threatening display of power. Your reign of murder ends here. Stain matches the energy with his own, bloodlust radiating from the end of his blade when he points it directly at Endeavor. His tone holds more animosity and hatred than Akatani could manage as he boldly replies, "Just try it, you fake." Already predicting Endeavor's next move, Akatani dives for his girlfriend to shield her from the incoming blast. Himiko. He calls out to her as his tentacles reach to make a shield. The raging inferno consumes the area around them and they're engulfed in hell's flames. The storefront window is as faded as the quality on the television screen behind it, but the dying hues of the image are still identifiable. The subtitles that have been put on to substitute for the lack of speakers are still very much readable. The kanji text says the same thing that's being shown. Last night was a shit show. Footage plays of the hell that was raised. A combination of Endeavor's flames and fire from destruction of property blending with the window's sun glare. The top story is a UA student's death at the hands of supposedly Stain. The name of the deceased is Tenya, a member of the Ingenium family. Endeavor is being proclaimed a hero for catching the killer and stopping the humanoid creatures called Namu that aided him. Apparently, Stain had been working with the ones responsible for the cataclysm, which just so happens to be the League of Villains. Akatani isn't sure what to make of the information dumped onto him after the matter, especially since he had been a part of it himself. Another big part of the story being woven by the news and media is the return of the Tokyo Ghoul, also cited during the incident. Akatani feels his phone vibrating in his pocket, tearing his attention away from the television momentarily. He only bothers to check it because it could be Himiko trying to call him. Who he's expecting to see attempting to contact him instead is exactly who it turns out to be though. Eraserhead and his detective friend have left Akatani nearly 100 text messages and just as many missed calls, with half of those calls resulting in voicemail messages. He can't blame them after the news report on the Hasu crisis. He had just wished to have prolonged this inevitability when running away. The TV displays him with his quirk on full display, protecting Himiko from the brawl between Stain and Endeavor. The two of them had used the fight as a diversion for their escape, but didn't get away unscathed. Plenty of flames had licked their arms and legs as they fled. They had also been caught on camera for the whole world to see. Even with his mask, Akatani had been exposed. Aizawa and Tsukachi would no doubt identify him easily. Considering their non-stop effort to get into touch with him, they likely already have. Boy, Akatani. The familiar high-pitched voice of his girlfriend alerts Akatani to her return. Before turning to face her, he crushes his cell phone with the aid of his quirk's strength enhancement. He doesn't know if the police and heroes would be able to track him somehow had he not broken, but he doesn't want to take the chance of there being a possibility. Plus, he doesn't need the constant reminder of his betrayal towards them. With Himiko back, he doesn't have to worry about keeping the device intact for her to call him either. Himiko isn't alone. Walking alongside her is a man covered in burns despite not having been present that night. Akatani immediately recognizes him as Dabai. He's wearing a long jacket despite the warm weather, hands shoved into its pockets. You've gone and made yourself quite the celebrity. Dabai jokes without a hint of amusement in his tone about the current situation. He gestures with a small nod while asking, "Afraid of the paparazzi?" Akatani's face scrunches up in confusion over the question, before realizing it's rhetorical and why it's being jokingly asked. He tugs at the white medical mask that he's wearing, suddenly made aware of it covering his mouth. While it does help to conceal his identity, that wasn't the reason he had chosen to wear it. When the bands behind his ears are pulled off, he shows Dabai the burn marks around his mouth. "Your dad's a dick, dude," Akatani says through scorched lips. Dabai's normally drooped eyelids lift fully and his body stands straight. The initial shock of Akatani's words getting the better of him. He tries shaking it off by returning to his usually bored expression. "My dad," though he's missing the slouched demeanor that comes with actual relaxation. He's not wanting to bother with the act. Akatani cuts Dabai off with a deadpan look that says more than any words could. Dabai's mouth stays open, but none of the lies or excuses he was going to use come out of it. Instead, he sighs heavily and asks, "How did you know?" Akatani simply holds the deadpan look. If it weren't for the burns, he's sure that Dabai would be blushing in embarrassment. The bashful expression alone is enough for them to communicate that the familial ties were obvious, not to mention the way he acted strangely in his brother's company. Himiko glances between the two, a delighted grin on her face. Eventually, she can't hold it in anymore and lets out a fit of giggles. Akatani almost joins her, but settles for a small smile instead. Dabai groans, not agreeing that having his identity outed is as funny as they think it is. Dabai brings a hand to his forehead, just short of a facepalm as it slides down. Not a single word. He spreads his fingers to peer out at the two teens so they can see how serious he is to anyone. But Himiko doesn't meet his eyes, still laughing. Dabai's got daddy issues. She continues to casually tease him, until his tone turns hard to iterate, "I'm serious." His hand drops away from his face so he can shoot her a look in order to make her stop. Akatani steps forward. Even though he's sure Dabai wouldn't actually do anything to harm her, he can't help but be a bit protective. "We'll keep it to ourselves." His own tone is just as hardened and defined, but it softens when he actually takes a moment and looks between his girlfriend and Dabai. "We've all got secrets about our past that we want to hide, Himiko, and I understand the need for privacy." He meets Dabai's eyes while tacking on at the end, "At least a little." Dabai holds his gaze with Akatani, but ultimately breaks it first, changing the subject. His eyes return to making contact as he asks, "You and Stain were tight?" Akatani blinks in surprise, cocking his head in equal confusion. "Huh, what makes you think that?" It's Dabai's turn to deadpan. He waves a lazy hand in the general direction of the television. "It's all over the news." Himiko playfully pouts, crossing her arms under her bust and stamping her feet. She recalls Stain saving her and asks her own question about him. "How come you never introduced me to him? I'm your girlfriend, aren't I?" It was fairly recent, Himiko." Akatani stammers as he tries to pacify her with an explanation first. Once he gets the blonde to settle down, he returns his attention to Dabai. "He respected me." That explanation is a little harder for him to manage, I think. As uncertain as he is of his own relationship to Stain, he also has to wonder why Dabai bothers to care. "Why do you ask?" Dabai looks away, trying to act casual and bored as always. But his words hold a weight to them that Akatani helps carry with every word that he listens to. "When you first came to me looking for that legion or whatever, I thought nothing of it. But they're saying Stain was a part of them. And Stain's philosophy ain't half bad. I'm thinking you and I can get along." Dabai's shoe scrapes the ground as he idly kicks the sidewalk's curb with a gentle swing. Akatani raises his head after hearing Dabai's words. "Are you saying?" He starts to wonder if the correlation between Stain and the League of Villains also corresponds with Dabai. "I know a guy. Calls himself Jurin. He's got connections." Dabai confirms those thoughts when he re-meets Akatani's eyeline. "I think he can get us in touch with that club you're looking for." Himiko bounces in place, emitting Akatani's inner joy physically for him. "More meat for you and more blood for me." Though her delighted cheer does earn a side-eyed glance from Dabai. "It's just like you wanted, right?" She grins happily for him as she eagerly awaits his affirmation. Though, it's rather hard for him to have a smile at the moment. "Yeah." So he puts his mask back on to hide the scars again. "It's exactly what I wanted." Despite the underground hero's deliberately light step, the first floorboard of the house buckles under his footfall. Instead of creaking, the loose wood groans in protest against the weight of his boot. The ground threatens to break like the furniture that rests atop it. Behind the slits in his yellow goggles, Eraserhead's eyes narrow into a focused squint. Broken bookshelves, their contents spilled out. A destroyed couch and equally splintered chairs. He's not sure yet whether the wake of destruction is a sign of struggle or another type of rampage. But it's concerning to him either way. Behind the inspective hero, Detective Tsukachi's rectangular eyes are set in an equal state of strabismus. He too analyzes the damage with a critical gaze, drawing his own conclusions. Eraserhead looks back at him, the two communicating with a quick glance after assessing the environment. Tsukachi nods before brandishing his badge from the pocket of his overcoat. "Akatani." It's Detective Naomasa Tsukachi. "I'm coming in." Eraserhead moves aside so that the detective can venture beyond him by a few steps. Each footfall carries through the floorboards just like the hero's first. "Let me know you're here if you can hear me." Tsukachi cautiously turns the corner at the end of the hall to check another room before calling out again. "Akatani." When the detective receives no answer, the underground hero makes an attempt. "Kid." His usually gruff voice holds a gentle tone that he ordinarily wouldn't use. "It's Aizawa." "I'm here too." Tsukachi checks over his shoulder, assessing his partner as much as the damage to the atmosphere. When Aizawa meets the gaze, Tsukachi looks away. "I don't think he's here." The detective sighs while shoving his badge back into his pocket. We should still do a sweep of the house to make sure that it's empty though. The underground hero hums in agreement, not yet having lowered his guard. The door showed signs of forced entry. His voice is lowered to be just short of a whisper in case they aren't alone. Rationalizing the situation and the possibilities, he deems it possible that somebody could have kidnapped or blackmailed Akatani. Tsukachi isn't quite as convinced, but nods along anyways. Aizawa is renowned for conspiracy theories, and despite some of those notions being proven true, that's his reason for his reluctance. Not to mention the recent news footage showing Akatani back in action as the Tokyo Ghoul. Tsukachi has to imagine he isn't the only one with resurfacing memories of the crime scenes Akatani had left behind in the beginning. The detective searches a bathroom, finding discarded box dye. Each container is for a black coloring. Akatani had no doubt been changing his hair hue to hide his identity. Tsukachi notes the detail before checking the shower, sink, and toilet for damage. When he finds nothing broken, it's safe to presume that the demolition had been limited to other confines of the house. He has half a mind to check the pantries and the fridge, but pauses in the hallway when he finds Aizawa back by the front entrance. The underground hero is surveying the door's damage, intent on proving whatever thought he has about its hinges being forcibly removed as valid. It was kicked in. Aizawa senses Tsukachi's eyes on him and addresses the detective without bothering to return the look. The hero gestures towards a marking that indicates he's right, dead in the center. A shoe imprint the same size as the one from the blood bank. Tsukachi balks at first, but quickly recovers when he sees the same evidence that Aizawa does. He mulls over the plausibility and the assumptions that can be made from that piece of information before remembering what Aizawa had theorized about Akatani's partner that night, the girlfriend. Aizawa has his own memory recollection of recent incidents, such as his phone call with the boy and his introduction to the girl not too long ago. Yes, the girlfriend. He tries to keep any judgment out of his tone but fails. Picking up on the way Aizawa sounds, Tsukachi raises a brow. You think she's a bad influence? He wonders. The underground hero looks between the door that was busted down and the detective before answering. I don't know yet. He then pushes past Tsukachi to inspect the other damages. She couldn't have been the one to have caused all this. Tsukachi rests his thumb against his bottom lip, chewing its nail as he contemplates things too. Even if she's a petite girl, it isn't impossible for her to have a quirk that grants strength of such capacity. For a moment, the thought of his dear friend Toshinori comes to mind, and how he as a hero flexes into a muscle form. The unassuming average form he has when not saving the day as All Might doesn't give the slightest hint of power that he's capable. How can you be so sure? The detective asks. Aizawa pulls his goggles down so that they hang around his neck along with the capture cloth he wears like a scarf. With his eyes uncovered, he meets Tsukachi's gaze. I'm assuming she's one and the same girl that he saved from Endeavor's flames during the Hasu news report. If she were capable of such destruction here, I doubt she would have required rescue. He sounds more contemplative than certain of his words. However, before Tsukachi can point that out and poke holes in the hero's hypothesis, Aizawa continues. And if Akatani was capable of killing the entire Yakuza, then I doubt a single individual would give him any trouble. Or, without a larger amount of property damage, at least. The two find themselves glancing back at the door. There's no real way of knowing what happened, but we shouldn't be making assumptions either. Tsukachi waves for Aizawa to follow him. There's more variables to be considered here anyways. The underground hero is led into the bathroom where the detective picks up an empty hair dye container to hand over for inspection. It could simply be that Akatani decided to run away with his girlfriend. Typical teenage romance. And last night was just them being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Aizawa's expression doesn't appear as hopeful as he sounds. He doesn't believe his own words. And neither does Tsukachi when he thinks about it for more than a second. He did sound strange on the phone when he was saying goodbye to Eri, as though it would be his last. Aizawa weighs the dye box in his hand like it's heavier than it actually is as he mulls over his last conversation with Akatani. Tsukachi hesitates to say this next part, uncertain of how Aizawa will react, but works up enough courage to do so anyways. I know you promised not to pry into his past, but I think we're way past promises at this point. Aizawa hears Tsukachi, but doesn't react. He just keeps staring at the dye box in his hand. Akatani had purposely altered his appearance. The boy has a reason for lying about his name. Under ordinary circumstances, it wouldn't be Aizawa's or anyone else's place to delve into why without his consent. Aizawa had grown close to the kid and his illegitimate sister. Aizawa doesn't want to betray their trust by compromising the relationship they've established. And yet, you're right. He must also be rational about the investigation. If we're going to find him, then we need to know who it is that we're actually looking for. He discards the dye box and hardens his resolve. Tsukachi does his best to look encouraging as he agrees, and that'll tell us where to look. Then he takes out his cell phone to text Tamakawa orders. I'll see what I can uncover at the precinct using what we already know about him, but I'm thinking we shouldn't limit ourselves. Aizawa takes less than a second to decipher the unspoken request from the detective, and his answer is a solid no. Tsukachi looks up from his phone mid-typing with an appalled expression, but Aizawa stays firm, shaking his head. It's never a good idea to get him involved when it comes to children. Whoever allowed that mammal to teach at a school is just as sick and delusional as he is. He knows exactly who it is that the detective wants to bring in on the investigation, and he downright refuses to make things all the more chaotic by agreeing. Tsukachi tries not to look or sound too amused by how resolute the underground hero is being. I feel like talking like that could cost you your job. He's not taking Aizawa's words that seriously. Seeing that's the case, Aizawa turns almost somber. He rarely wears his emotions on his sleeve, but he's rather adamant when it comes to Akatani. I just don't want him getting any ideas. This one is a delicate matter. He treats the boy with fragility as much as he does the girl he's adopted. Tsukachi can't help but sympathize with the man and places a consoling hand on his shoulder to say as gently as possible, "It could be more fragile than you already think it is." When Aizawa looks the detective in the eye, he sees the sincerity and understands the importance without needing the added, "That's why we need to know." He tries to resist, but finally gives in. Aizawa brushes Tsukachi's hand off his shoulder, "Fine," and heads for the exit. "I'll talk to Nezu." Tsukachi watches Aizawa's receding back, but doesn't bother chasing after it. After all, he has to treat the scene properly and get a forensics team over. The detective turns around to get one last good look at the mess that's been made. He doesn't want to regret giving the boy a chance, but he's not so sure he's dealing with a basic boy. All the blood that's been spilled and all the lies that have been told. Just who is Akatani Mikumo? Was he always just the Tokyo ghoul in disguise? When the trio of league candidates first enter the bar, their initial impression of the barren brick walls is that the significantly spacious hideaway is just short of being a less than decorative basement dwelling. Muted colors of bottles on the shelves behind the bar counter match the unadorned lazy spin of the ceiling fan. The place itself seems just as disinteresting as its disinterested patron. A man with faded blue hair sits with his back to Akatani, Dabai, and Himiko. The living purple mist behind the counter faces the group instead. The only one well-dressed for the occasion. Not even Jurin, the intermediary middleman, bothers with a classy fashion sense. He opts to wear nothing more chic than a fluffy scarf and circular glasses. "I've got some kids here saying they're interested in your group. I assure you, these ones are more capable than the last bunch. Not like the other recruits." He twists a toothpick in his mouth with his tongue as he speaks. However, the slight slurring of words is still decipherable. Akatani and the others are expecting who they assume is the bartender to speak in response. But it's the blue-haired man that Jurin happened to be actually addressing. And who are they? He turns his head just enough for the trio to get a glimpse of his chapped lips grinding out his question. Jurin grins, all teeth minus one in the middle on full display. He gestures towards the bunch with a mild flourish, as though he's presenting them. "I'll let them speak for themselves." His eyes glint the same as his tinted glasses when he glances towards the group that he's brought. Himiko, the most enthusiastic of the trio, is the first to jump at the opportunity of an introduction. "You're friends with Mr. Staney, right? We've been looking for you." She practically vibrates in place as her face tinges red in excitement. The blue-haired man does bother to spare a glance over his shoulder, but it's a rather dismissive look. He has red eyes crusted around the edges that flick over to Dabai instead. "You don't look like very much of a league. You look rather gross, actually." Dabai returns the critical gaze with one of his own squinted glares. Hearing that must strike a nerve, because the man returns to his former state, no longer considering them worthy of a second glance. "Kurogiri, warp them away." He lazily waves a hand as though he's shooing away a fly. Akatani mentally notes the bartender's name and potential teleportation quirk before listening to the rest. A brat, a guy with no manners, and a silent creep. "I don't like any of them." Himiko's earlier excitement diminishes a little, an expression of disappointment overcoming her as she cocks her head to the side. "Huh." The one named Kurogiri gives the girl somewhat of an apologetic glance before denying the blue-haired man's request. "Come now, they've traveled all this way just to meet you. You may as well humor them with a chat." Kurogiri's gaze then shifts to Jurin. "What's more, if they're being introduced by our influential broker friend here, we can be sure that they're at least competent fighters." Jurin shrugs, not elaborating on whether they are or aren't. Akatani doesn't know how acquainted Himiko and Dabai are with him for him to actually know. Plus, the broker had only met him personally very recently to definitely not know. But it's a response he can get behind during a sensitive negotiation. "Either way, I'll take my finder's fee now." Jurin holds out his hand with the expectation of receiving payment. But Kurogiri isn't quite as accommodating a second time. He raises up his own hand, introductions first. Denying the request momentarily, Jurn begrudgingly retracts his hand and nods for the trio to share their names. I'm Himiko Toga. Akatani's girlfriend does the liberty of starting them off, and this is Akatani. I go by Dabai right now. Dabai does his own introduction. Himiko and Akatani, knowing his real name, share a look with one another, but don't say anything out loud. The blue-haired man turns around, now giving them all his undivided attention. No good. I want to know your real name. But he singles out Dabai with a pointed finger specifically. Before things can escalate, Akatani decides that it's finally time that he says something. He takes a step forward to direct everyone's attention to him before announcing, I'm the Tokyo Ghoul. Everyone aside from Himiko shares an expression that crosses both shock and awe. But Akatani isn't finished. He looks around the small bar, still only counting 2 people present. Enter the League of Villains. Is this really all of you? It's his turn to be unimpressed by what he sees. The blue-haired man seems skeptical, his critical gaze from earlier returning full swing. But he still humors Akatani. Yes, I'm the leader. Now knowing that he's finally found the last of his targets and that they're of small numbers, with the leader right in front of him, he's already calculating how to kill them. The leader taps a finger on the bar counter as he demands from Akatani, prove you are who you say you are. His scleer darkening, the ghoul obliges. A predatory instinct kicks in, back burning to unleash his equivalent of claws. He remembers Aizawa's bandages, Eri's guardian, and his previously poor condition within the UA medbay. Akatani plans to return the favor. The ghoul growls as he prepares to pounce. Oh, I intend to. But as forthwith as his killing intent had expanded, it instantaneously evaporates. An equal force opposes his own, casting over him like the shadow of a bigger beast. Akatani's burning blood runs cold when he hears an amused chuckle coming from behind the bar counter. His eyes are drawn to the source of intimidation, spotting a miniature television that says only audio in kanji as red as his shrunken pupils. No need. The disembodied voice is deceptively soothing. Hidden in the tone is that same dominant power Akatani had sensed. It's a deep and demanding boom. I would like a private audience with our most prestigious guest, if you mind. The League of Villains leader doesn't seem so much like the actual leader anymore when he inquisitively stares at the small TV monitor. Sensei. The owner of the voice remains in charge, making it clear that was an order and not a request. Take time to get acquainted with his friends, Tamura. You may learn a thing or two about companionship and allegiance. They sound as though they're talking down to a child. The power dynamic and who reigns in superiority is more evident than ever. It'd be funny if it weren't so terrifying. Akatani looks back at Himiko and Dabai, expecting the true leader to reveal themselves. But he's suddenly struck by a wave of nausea, throwing him off balance. He can feel something climbing up his throat. He feels sick. It's reminiscent of when he vomits the unprocessed attempts at eating anything other than flesh. Wait, but what comes out of his mouth this time instead is a black goo as flexible and tangible as his kagyun. It wraps around his body, covering his face and concealing his vision. And then, suddenly, the darkness transports him to a room just as pitch black. What? He fights the gag reflex of having something forcibly breach the walls of his throat but fails miserably, momentarily. He wonders if that was Kurogiri's warping quirk. However, that thought is immediately overtaken by panicked voices when the presence he had felt earlier increases tenfold. His instincts scream at him. His mind yells just as vocally, but his body becomes paralyzed. He's trapped in a state of petrification as the crushing pressure of sheer power makes itself known to him. The aura makes Akatani collapse to his knees, his whole body bending over as he fights back the urge to puke for real this time. He's being forced to bow to the mightier being. The submissive state is one that he knows well. He's seen his own prey do the same sometimes. To be on the receiving end for once, he can't help but shed tears. He can hear the beeping of a heartbeat monitor. He's not sure if that's real or if it's a part of what he's currently imagining. The extreme emanation forces him to experience hallucinations of his own death as well. Torn and dismembered like he's left some of his own victims, shredded and violated, drowning in his own blood, suffocating as he's choked by the tremendous pressure, stabbed through his pounding heart, pierced and cut wide open. He feels as though he's falling from a great height. Then he lands in hell where he burns alive. Each assaulting image is a beating that makes his entire body tremble. The voice returns, making Akatani shudder. He's pretty sure that voice belongs to the devil. This is the first time you've felt inferior to another out of a naturally born instinct, isn't it? The tone is genuinely inquisitive rather than taunting. That only intensifies the effect of the feeling he's unable to endure. He feels like an ant that's being studied, played with, by a giant that could squash it at any moment it loses interest. All Akatani can manage is a meek nod. His mind is too distraught to think of a verbal response, though he'd doubtfully be capable of formulating any coherent speech if he were thinking clearly. Akatani recluses at the close proximity of the voice. You have no conception of how far up the food chain goes, boy. It sounds so close and yet so distant at the same time. The most lethal of predators are good at concealing their bloodlust. You should take that advice into practice. I could easily sense her hostile intent towards Tamura. Akatani recognizes the tone as the same that had been used with the so-called Tamura. He's being talked down to, perceived as an inferior child. In the presence of this being, he knows that to be true. Have you nothing to say for yourself, boy? Akatani's throat is too dry to say anything, until the same force that commands him to be docile demands that he speak. He's a threat. Akatani's voice trembles more than his body as he admits to the desire of wanting Tamura dead. He knows he can be smited easily should the owner of the voice so deem it, and he's just given them a valid reason. To the child you've grown an attachment with. The true leader of the League of Villains shocks Akatani even more. He's shaken to his core that such an unstoppable force knows about his relationship to Eri as the reason for their being at odds. Don't be so surprised. I'm capable of reading your thoughts like an open book. Through all the terror and desperation, it's easy to find the root of those emotions. Akatani struggles to breathe as he takes in that information. His mind is capable of being invaded, his thoughts read, and quite possibly corrupted. He theorizes that the feeling he's perceiving from the mind reader's presence comes from that same source of power. But part of him knows that a good margin is genuinely just the person's unmitigated existence. Unfortunately, I cannot allow you to end Tamura's life. He is of importance to me. He's reminded of that aura when it washes over him like a wave in an ever-endless bottomless sea. However, I see a potential in you that would be a shame to waste. You could prove useful to Tamura. Before he can sink to the bottom and drown, crushed by the pressure, he feels himself pulled back to the surface. Akatani gasps for air as he greedily tries to inhale it all for himself. The force that had been weighing down on him has been significantly lifted, but his body still falls to the floor. He's beyond exhausted. Who are you? He tries to get a good look at who caused him such grief. In the thick darkness, he can make out what looks like the equivalent of a throne. Several wires and cables are connected to it, an array of monitors much like the one from the bar also attached, and seated at its center is a well-dressed man. I have many names, most prominently, All for One. In account for my abundance of quirks and the unique ability to take more from others. The promise of power from that introduction alone has Akatani quivering all over again. But when he sees the face belonging to that power, he's beyond horrified. But you will call me Sensei. The scarred flesh where eyes should be somehow stares into Akatani's soul more than actual eyes would be able to. Why you plan to take my quirk from me? It suddenly makes sense to him how someone could be so limitlessly indomitable. Oh, what's this? A kindling of hope that I hear. All for One tilts his head to the side as he outwardly notes Akatani's tone. How interesting. Akatani imagines a life without his quirk. If it weren't for his uncontrollable impulses and his extreme urges, he would have been able to lead a regular life. His mother would still be alive. Maybe, just maybe, he would have been able to still get into UA with Kakan. I can only view your thoughts so much. Would you be opposed to meeting a quirk specialist colleague of mine? All for One's intrigue sends shivers down Akatani's spine and he begins to regret the desire to be rid of his quirk. He can't imagine someone so evil increasing their strength with his quirk too. What do you want from me? Akatani struggles to push himself upwards. It takes all he has, but he somehow manages to push off with his hands and just stay on his knees. All for One watches the boy with sick pleasure, smiling softly as he enjoys the entertaining display. He speaks at a low decibel. Almost assuredly, not your quirk. Though powerful, it wouldn't pale in comparison to my arsenal, but conveys anything but a form of assurance. I'm much more interested in your mind, especially when he extends a hand. Akatani instinctively shies away from the near contact. All sorts of alarms and warnings going off in his head, especially when he sees something crawling beneath the surface of the man's sleeve. The length and size of All for One's fingers, a red-headed centipede twists itself around his hand and reaches towards Akatani. Acting on a survival reflex, his senses telling him it's no ordinary insect, the boy scurries back faster than the actual bug crawls. Akatani pants heavily. His unnatural pupils focused on the centipede that reaches just short of his face. Its performal spines twiddle in an attempt at making contact. If All for One is displeased, he doesn't show it. If anything, he finds the reaction humorous, letting out a low chuckle. He pulls his arm away, the centipede retreating back under his sleeve. We'll both have to test our patience then. He lifts the same hand he had used to prop his chin against his knuckles, another time. Akatani swallows in between heavy breaths, unable to express anything but relief that he hadn't been subjected to whatever All for One literally had up his sleeve. Though he also can't help but be unsettled by the unspoken promise of another time. He shakily lifts his head, daring to look at the man responsible for such an impending feeling of absolute damnation. The business attire is almost as casual as his sitting position. The lack of a tie and the few loose buttons at the top are nonchalant. Yet, the face that wears it all is just like the aura he emits. A horrifically sinister contortion of what a person's worst self can be, personified as a form of evil. Even without sockets, Akatani can feel All for One's eyes on him. He's not sure how the man can see, but he knows that he must. He can't help but shake the feeling of being studied like he's bacteria under a microscope. You will return to Tamura and agree to work with him. You will not harm him if you don't want the same to be done to the girls you're so fond of. Akatani feels small in comparison to the potential menace of this particular predator. He has no choice but to accept the true monster's conditions, now knowing his role in the criminal climate has drastically changed. The threat to Eri and Himiko is one that can be delivered on, and he'd be unable to do anything about it. He's been caged again, this time by something far worse than the heroes. He remembers what All for One wished to be addressed as and answers, "Why yes, sensei." All for One's smile becomes even more wicked, if that's even possible. The Tokyo ghoul is now his pet.